This is Brave New History. We're here with Dr. Gus Lott, and we're talking about Cain and Abel, John, Jacob, Esau, and nihilism. And yeah, thank you so much for coming on.
It's a pleasure, Lott. Thanks for having me.
So you are not a doctor of theology, but of the hard sciences, and then you have a master of divinity.
That's right. That's my stereoscopic view, you might say. So my PhD is in biophysics, so that even itself kind of spans across kind of a couple of realms. And my work has been in neurosciences and robotics. Those kind of places, kind of engineering and science components of that. And then the Masters of Divinity from a Presbyterian seminary, and I kind of grew up mainline Protestant, had a lot of this scaffold already there, you might say. And then so those are kind of the two places that I stand. If I have a kind of serious theological background, I kind of struggle with people like scientists like that will come and kind of try to have a theological position without really kind of they'll take kind of the kind of worst case fundamentalist crazy position and then kind of like thrash it as if they're making progress between science and religion. I do take this conflict between them seriously, and I think it's really important. And part of getting the Master's of Divinity and serving a church and these kind of things was to kind of, I think, hopefully kind of open up hearts and create a kind of hey, I care about this stuff. I care about both of these intensely. They're a big part of my life, that kind of thing. I don't want someone that I'm talking to appreciate that. I'm just not a scientist espousing a kind of that I guess that basically sums it up, you might say.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe we'll just start into it. What is going on with Cain and Abel?
Yeah, so I love the story. I think it's incredible. It's the story of the first murder, but I think also with the quote from Jesus about, if you have anger, this is just like murder, right? And in Matthew, and this idea that it's also the story of the first anger. And I think it kind of describes two types of people in the world, you might say. There's two types of people in the world. There's Cain and there's Abel. And so I think that's kind of what the story is getting at. To understand it, I think you have to take a step back to the Garden of Eden story and see what that is. And I think it's just this. I take a fairly straightforward approach to reading it, and I say straightforward because everybody says that. But I think that the idea that the tree of the knowledge of good and bad is the turning point of this whole story. What does that mean? People ask this question, and I think then people say, "Oh, it means sex or knowledge about carnal stuff or whatever." I think it means the knowledge of good and bad. I think it means ethics, judgment, right? And so I think non-judgment or coming to a place where you can see someone and kind of not judge them because of the way you view the world, not because you should and it's good, or bad to judge or whatever you think it's bad. Like, when you see them in a way that your vision is through non-judgment, that fruit that causes suffering, which is what the Eden story kind of leads to, is purged from yourself when you're not judging, right? That fruit is gone. And in a way, it's setting up the problem statement of the Bible broadly, or at least threaded within the text. And this way, it's saying that you think you can judge the world through you say this shouldn't be, or that shouldn't be, or these horrible things that are happening shouldn't be. So just that's a wrong idea. And so coming at this from a scientist, I come at it from the idea that this story is saying we think we have free will, which is the idea of moral agents in the world that can do good or bad, that have moral agency. And I think the story is saying that's not true. This is a world that is deterministic, that is God. So the language of the time would be God's will controls all. Every mote of dust, every action is carefully and precisely controlled by God's will. The synonymous way of framing it today is just the laws of physics control everything. This is not identifying God with nature. It's identifying the kind of control of everything that happens with the will of God. And it's the same language as saying like the laws of physics control everything, a kind of like modern determinist scientist view of things. And I think there's really strong evidence to believe that this is the case, right? So one thing that really just, I had kind of been struggling with this hypothesis for a long time, and then came across this quote from Josephus in the first century. You know, everybody loves to quote Josephus, but when he's describing the sects of the Jews, the sects of the groups of Jews, right? The Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes, right? He talks about a lot of what they do and a lot of their differences. But at one point in the Antiquities of Book 13, section 171, and what follows, he gives the only philosophical difference between them that he ever mentions. And he says, the Sadducees believe that there is no fate, that humans are in control of their own destiny entirely. This makes sense because they're like the wealthy people that are behind the temple, and they want you to think that it's all them and they deserve their wealth, right? And the Pharisees think that fate has something to do with it, but we also have a role to play. These are more like the Stoics, right? I think fate plays a role, but we choose we get to do it. I think he was making a connection between the two, between the groups, the Greek philosophies, and he was communicating to a Greek audience, wanted to say this is kind of how we can match them. The Sadducees are like the Epicureans, these like pure free will people. The Pharisees are like the Stoics, who have a kind of determinist thing, but then we can act in it somehow with agency, with moral agency. Then he says the Essenes think that fate governs all. Everything happens according to its will. Right. And he uses fate and God and the will of God essentially synonymous in a lot of his work. Yeah. And so this is like how Josephus frames the division, right? And he says there's like 4,000 Essenes in Judea and 6,000 Pharisees. And so it's like a major Jewish distinction between these two. And it's not a minor group, these people that believe that God is responsible for all good and all bad, everything. Right. It's like that verse in Isaiah 45, 7, where which is one they love to throw at the Old Testament class in seminaries. The idea that it says, I create light and darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things, Yahweh. And it uses that special creation word from Genesis 1, bara, the Hebrew word that's only associated with God's creative acts to describe how he creates evil, like God creates evil. And it's really something it struggles with a lot, and as you can see, the translator is struggling with it. But I think there's a lot to that, because right above in that chapter, there's a declaration about King Cyrus of Persia, who's coming in to liberate them from Babylon. Right, this section of Isaiah is generally thought to be around the Babylonian and their liberation period, and around the exile in Babylon. And this idea that the Zoroastrians through Cyrus bring a kind of free will moral dualism with them, that since they were the liberators, and kind of enable what the subsequent Second Temple period through their funding of the temple and all these things, their ideas would start to creep in, and these are the great benefactors of our Second Temple, and these ideas in that Persian imperial period would begin to creep into Hebrew thought. And so the idea that the idea of moral dualism, which is really kind of a hallmark of some of main branches of Zoroastrianism, which is the Persian religion at the time, they're very light-dark oriented, and they're moral dualism oriented. And light is associated with good, and dark is associated with evil. The world started in light, and then darkness caused this fall. It's pre-human. And you got to pick a side, a lot of moral agency going on in it. And that verse in Isaiah essentially says, Cyrus is on the way. We reject this dualism. God is in control of everything. You think there's Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu and the light and the dark, right, that are in charge of, and they're going to fight and they're brothers. No. Right, there's this kind of declaration there, I think, of an author early on in response to this. And you could even say that the Garden of Eden story comes from this period where they see this kind of like poisoning of the kind of deterministic faith of this total God is in control of everything. Of course, the world is exactly as God wants it to be. That's what it means to be omnipotent, right? Like what do you mean the world is not like God wants it? Like what does that question mean? right? And so you get these ideas of like Satan and this battle between these two, as if like it'll be set right in the future, this kind of thing. And so I think there are a lot of scholars that date the Garden of Eden story to kind of this Persian period or later, after exile, you might say, because I mean I learned in seminary that it was from the Davidic period, and there are a lot that kind of hold this idea. You've got to kind of the major argument that gets me is that it's just not commented on in the rest of the Bible, right? Like nobody it's very like it's there. Maybe there are some, but it's just Eve is never mentioned again. And you know, in the entire book, right? And so and the whole like the concepts are only vaguely mentioned in most of the Torah. Whereas in Second Temple period, there's tons of commentary on the Garden of Eden story. A lot of the pre-Christian documents, the Apocalypse of Adam and Eve, and these other things are like, oh well, let's expand on the story and talk about it. So you have Josephus' quote that says that free will and determinism were like a major dividing line. There's no Sadducees, very few Sadducees. It's primarily Pharisees and Essenes, right? And so many scholars, they don't accept that Jesus was a determinist, but they say that they want to associate him with Essenes, right? Because clearly his opponents are Pharisees and Sadducees in the New Testament, and you know, they want to say that Josephus is maybe off in some of this, but we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and and most scholars I think tend to say, okay, there are definitely deterministic elements in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's a light-dark dualism and a lot of sharing with John. So this determinism, I think, appears in John as well. And so a lot of the hymns and the documents say, okay, God has doled out light and dark according to his mysteries, like, and everything that happens is according to God's will. And there's this like very strong determinism in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so that in a way, the reason we think they're Essene has a lot to do with this philosophy matching what Josephus says about Essenes. And so this idea that the Dead Sea Scrolls witness something just like a day's walk from Jerusalem and just a little bit south from where John the Baptist was baptizing. And that many people think John the Baptist might have had an association with the Dead Sea community, the Qumran community. There's the idea that, I mean, there's clear determinism in those scrolls. But I think there's a pressure to not read these over into the New Testament for interesting reasons, and primarily because I think free will is a central doctrine of Christianity. And I think a lot of scholars just think free will is true. And I think that they're fine with saying, okay, the Qumran community is determinist because they don't exist anymore and they just had their cosmology wrong, right? But if like the New Testament is calling for determinism, no free will, then, you know, like this meritocracy that my job is predicated on is threatened, right? And I just don't believe this cosmology anyway. And if I believed this, that would mean these guys in the New Testament just had a wrong cosmology, right? And so at any rate, to take that back to the Garden of Eden story, I think this idea that humans were created without the knowledge of good and bad in them is how the story starts off, and that it's moral knowledge. It's the knowledge of good and bad, right? It's that straightforward, and that this is how Hebrew children were considered, right? And if you look at like Deuteronomy 139, God says the ones that can enter, everybody has to die except for the ones that can enter, the children that don't know good from bad. Use the same, they don't know right from wrong. It's the same phrase. They're not held responsible for what's going on there. They're the ones that can enter the promised land. The famous Isaiah 7:14, which is quoted at the opening of the New Testament in Matthew on chapter 1, right, is the Emmanuel verse. It's immediately followed by the prophet saying, before the child knows how to choose good or reject evil, then the following will happen, right? And he's describing a period. Josephus is describing Esau in the Antiquities, and he gets to that point and he says something by the time that the child knew how to choose the good, right? And so it seems Josephus has this idea that to be a child is to not have moral discernment knowledge, to be kind of in a perpetual flow state. I think me having 4 kids, I think this is I can understand that, right? And so like I think this was what it means to be a child in the Hebrew conception. There's really not much else that really distinguishes a child from a adult. And I think that if there's one person in the Torah that's named a man of God, it's Moses, and I think it's Deuteronomy 33. And the fact that Christians are kind of identify themselves around being a child of God, the children come to me, or be as a Gospel of Thomas is a ton of this, be as a child to enter the kingdom. That this is what it means to turn on the kind of idea of judgment and moral knowledge. That simple, right? And so they start this way in the Garden of Eden. They gain this knowledge, and it leads to the suffering. It's like an etiology of our suffering. I would say it's kind of like a story of growing up, right? It's a story of going from childhood to adulthood, right? And the fact that you bring in this wrong idea of judgment and merit into the world and deserving things and this kind of stuff. And that exactly fits with the idea that the world is deterministic, or God is in total control, to use that language. But people come to think that they have free will and that they can work for salvation or things like this. I can deserve something, right? Or I can merit it, right? But really, it's just coming to understand that none of that is true, that nobody deserves anything, that there is no real, like ethical reality. We use things like ethics as a way to bludgeon one another. We like to say, I see like gun violence happening, and I say, I don't like that. Say like that I don't like that. And then we say, it shouldn't happen. We use words like should and could. And then we throw that out there to like try to control others instead of saying, I don't want this, which is true. And somebody else may say, well, I'm fine with it. And that may be true of them. But saying that it shouldn't happen objectively is just, it's not real. That's not like, right. And actually there's great power. It seems like insanity to say this. It seems like you're giving up this great, powerful, manipulative tool to like achieve what you want. But I mean, the whole progress of the sciences and maybe the progress of medicine, you might say, is figuring out how things are not your fault. And we move to like diagnosing post-traumatic stress disorder after General Patton would slap the guy and say, get it together, man. Now we give them SSRIs and therapy. And there's still a great pressure on this, and people that don't believe that that's appropriate. But I think it kind of characterizes our move into a postmodern period where we say, no, like we move from, say, the modern idea, with Martin Luther King saying, well, not be judged by the color of the skin, but by the content of the character, this dream, and moving into a world where we say, there's actually no valid categories of judgment. Someone that has a bad character inherited this just like one inherits the color of their skin, right? And it's extremely powerful. We find we put boot prints on the moon, and we can make significant advancements treating things like PTSD and others. And modern therapy techniques are just built on determinism, essentially. And sciences are built on this. And so in a lot of ways, I think this was the same idea. It's not a new idea, right? This idea that we have merit. I think people can just see through a lot of those stories and always have. Well, I know Jeff Bezos' dad gave him or his parents gave him a big invest. I didn't get $500,000 from my parents to start a business. That kind of thing. And at the right time and place. I mean, he didn't pick where he was born or what all was going on. I think people have always been able to see through these kind of narratives of merit when they really sat down and looked at it, and that it's been something that's always been going. It's just been a long period of moral realism that has essentially been enforced at the stake, with the threat of burning the heretics, up till, say, Galileo and the movement of the modern scientific period, where Galileo kind of took the Platonism of the heavens and said in a way, oh, you think those are gods up there? Well, we're one of them, moving with them and among them. And you might say that's kind of very similar to what Jesus said, right? He brought the heavens and the earth together, right? This union of heaven and earth in Jesus. And that image, this is what Galileo did. He looked at the moon through his telescope, and they thought, oh, that Terminator line is perfectly straight. It's a Platonic perfection. And he looked at it and he said, there are mountain ranges up there on the moon, and that is a jagged line, and you can look at this, right? And he essentially transformed our thought of here and there as different, as that's the Platonic perfection. And so in a way, we realize that this has a perfection to it. It's all, there's really no judgment to be had. There's just understanding to be had. And so I think this philosophy is ancient, and I think it's the basis of the compassion that we see in a lot of parts of the New Testament. I think it's core to early layers in the text. And so my kind of ideas about how John developed are around this idea that at Qumran you have determinists. They have a light-dark dualism. And they set themselves against the world in a way. It's very different than the God so loved the world kind of idea. They're very much in opposition to it. And a lot of scholars do rightly, I think, criticize this as kind of an inconsistent theology, right? And I think maybe what happened was a group that might have been led by Jesus or John the Baptist or others had this realization that if God is in total control of everything, then the world is exactly as it should be, if that has any meaning. There is no sacred and profane difference. Everything is actually sacred. Profane is thought to be like a category of unclean, not as it should be, things that need to be fixed, right? And if everything is according to God's will, nothing is unclean, right? And so I think you can draw a line between this insight, it's kind of maybe a small tweak that was already there, that just opened up all these consequences that are already present in places like Buddhism and other religions that kind of recognize this determinism already and have a lot of compassion and kind of like emptiness theology and things like that around deserving. And, you know, so Bodhidharma goes into China and they say, well, I built all the emperor says, I built all these palaces. How much merit do I have? And he looks at him and he says, no merit whatsoever. You know, that kind of story, right? And really, what? And he just freaked out. But the point was, there's no merit to it at all. Like, that's because they're essentially determinists. Everything is an interdependent web of causation in the Buddhist idea. For some Buddhists, this is not like all Buddhists, but I think it's kind of certainly core to Zen Buddhism. But yeah, so I think this is not a new idea. I don't mean to say that they were influenced by Buddhism, but I think that I kind of think it's a more ancient Hebrew idea, and it's like built into like the basis of their language in many ways. So, at any rate, the Garden of Eden story in this way is a story that says the world is actually the metaphor is, and it's hard to say it out loud right now. God is in control of everything. That sounds like tyrannical. It sounds oppressive because I think we're thinking in free will terms. But when you really understand this, I think you can say things like Jesus said, and you understand it. You're neither slave nor free, to use the Pauline language. There's a kind of like unity and in emptiness of ego. There's an emptying of ego, like the Philippians hymn, and then there's a kind of like identification at that emptiness with the divine. And it's not you doing it, right? I no longer live, Christ lives in me. This kind of like language, right? And so there's a kind of like ego emptiness that comes with understanding determinism that's very hard to grasp, right? There's this difficulty moving from the idea that I'm in control of the world. I'm in control of me, right? There's this idea that we are like puppets, you know, marionettes, and you got strings. And, I control myself. I hold I hold the controls. I drive this car. And then most people say, oh, determinism. Well, that means that somebody else is controlling these and I can't do what I want. And I'm just like moving and I can't. I've been thrown into the trunk of my car and somebody else is driving. And really, that's still the idea of free will. You're not there yet, right? That's the idea that your will is free but impotent. You can't do what you want to do, right? There's this fatalism, you might say. And then there's a kind of movement where you have a shift in worldview and there's no puppets and no puppeteers. It's just all strings, all relationships. And so you got these like God is love and the kind of union of male and female images of God, this bridal chamber image, these kind of things. And I think the union of male and female image can go back to non-judgment as well, because right before they consume the fruit of the knowledge of good and bad, Adam, say an androgyne, you know, is split in half into male and female. And then they consume the knowledge of good and bad. And so making the male and female one is to move to a protological state before judgment. And if Genesis 2:17 identifies eating the knowledge of good and bad with death, and Genesis 2 and 3 love metaphors, the serpent says, your eyes will be opened if you eat this, right? I mean, were they blind before? No, this is a metaphor, right? This is a metaphor that the serpent uses right there. And so death comes out, and if death is associated with living in judgment, with living in a world where you imagine what should be and you hallucinate what is good and bad about the world, instead of seeing it as it is, as whole, as it is, then you're kind of a walking dead. You're kind of already not in the world that's here. You're in your idea of what the world should be, and there's a lot of anxiety and suffering because of that. And that to be resurrected is something that means to have this knowledge of judgment purged from you in a very important way, is to be brought back from the dead, if death is that. And then that means to live in the moment in a very important and empowering way, I would say. Something that's not just philosophizing, but something that's really grounded and has real effects on your life. So the Garden of Eden story I see as that kind of narrative, as a kind of like growing narrative into adulthood, and how the adults characterized the suffering that they felt and where it came from. And I think it's well grounded in the Hebrew scriptures, this interpretation, and in the historical critical evidence that determinism was. So Joseph Blenkinsop from Notre Dame wrote about Isaiah 45:7, the knowledge of good and bad verse. He's a Notre Dame professor, and he said this is from a time when it was okay to attribute all good and all bad to God, but in the old Hebrew religion, or the author of Sirach, the Wisdom of Sirach, this intertestamental text, revisits the Garden of Eden story and then says and adds on the bit that, okay, so God put Adam in the garden, and there's the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, and then he says, and then he showed them what good and bad were, and then told them not to eat this tree, right? So he had to add this part because he knew that they're not moral agents when you put them in there. They can't do right or wrong because they don't know what it is. So the idea that they did something wrong when they ate the fruit of that tree just doesn't follow the basic meaning of the text, right? And so they're just not moral agents. They can't do anything wrong or right. Like, it's just not. They're just doing naturally their thing. And this was an insight that my youth group professor gave me. It was like, he saw me kind of questioning a lot of this stuff, and he said, "Okay, I wrote this essay in seminary." Scandalous, but but anyway, this idea that they didn't have this knowledge, just as Hebrew children were conceived at multiple points in the text to not have this knowledge, and that this would be a normal way of thinking under determinism. If you don't think people have free will, you don't see things as good or bad, or your ability to have acted otherwise, which seems to be a basis for a lot of people's ideas of what moral agency means. Certainly of the United States' justice system. It's written out in Supreme Court case law that people know the good from the bad and can choose, and so this justifies punishment. And so I think this even has teeth today in a really big and important way. But the Garden of Eden story is an insight into the human condition that I think is unparalleled in Western literature, right? In this way, and that in that it's just so on its face, and then the number of mental gymnastics that people go through to talk about what this knowledge of good and bad means is just incredible to me. But I can see it because the whole moralizing of the church is essentially just falling back into Pharisaic thinking that happened early on in the movement. Maybe since the teacher was killed real early in his teaching, and didn't get to live on, by Akiva did until he was 80 something, and progressed Pharisaism. That you get this opening to Greeks and other things, it's kind of like opening up to a sanctified world. Then it brings in a bunch of voices that they drown out this initial insight but it's still there, and I still see it there, and I love that it's in John. So I would say that is my interpretation of the Garden of Eden story. That this is the nature of what humans are and why we suffer, and then you can actually see it play out you can see the Garden of Eden story play out in. It's kind of like the lens I used to peel apart the layers of John. There was an initial state where a teacher understood that the knowledge of good and bad was purged from this person, Jesus, because of this insight that he had. And this was the truth that came into the world. And then you can see in real time, I think, in the Gospels, this knowledge coming back in. And there are plenty of places we can talk about in John where this happens. And so you can essentially see the narrative of Garden of Eden happening as a literary critical device to understand the evolution of the church from a non-judgmental, emptying narrative into a judgmental power system. You can essentially it essentially validates the Eden story as anthropology, Because it's an anthropological narrative. This is a fundamental thing about what it is to be a human being. And then you can see it happen in the first century in the New Testament. It becomes it's a really powerful tool. And so I think it's this neat kind of like bootstrapping deal that essentially validates itself and I think we can just see it all the time. I think we can see it happen in the way we treat children as they grow up and this kind of thing, the way we treat juveniles different than adults. And we understand this on some level. I think the real insight you get to is when you understand that nobody makes themselves, and that everybody, no matter how violent and vile they seem, is in a way whole. And it's an understanding that whole story that we can actually solve the problem. It's super empowering. This is how science works. If you just stop looking for explanations and say, yeah, all that's true, but he just needs to not do what's bad, right, which is a common refrain you hear, then you've essentially stopped trying to solve the problem. And you've laid the systemic causes that brought about this violence into the lap of this person and then make them suffer for it. Right. So I think it's way got teeth today. It's a really important story. And so I would say this is the essence of the modern scientific revolution so Darwin, in his own handwriting, which we have, rejects free will. He writes that nobody deserves praise or blame for anything. And this is not some armchair scientist that's just talking outside of his lane. This is the guy that like gave us the basic understanding of an inheritance, right? The idea that everything is inheritance, right? And so everything about all behavior is all inheritance, not just genetic, but I mean, he didn't really know about DNA at the time, but like it's the ideas that we inherit, and we're constantly inheriting. And then Einstein has the same kind of rejection of free will, even in the face of the horrors of World War II as a Jew, right? And being offered, he was offered the presidency of the new nation of Israel and turned it down. But he was very much understanding what all was going on, and still writes about rejecting free will and the kind of like peace it brought him. And he did this because he redefined our understanding of causality in the 20th century and what causality means and how like time works. And so it just was not fun. It just was an incoherent hypothesis for him to go around judging people or thinking this person could work otherwise. So that's the kind of framing I bring to to what the next story is, which is the Cain and Abel story. And I think it's trying to tell the same story, but to understand it, you've got to know what the names mean. Right. And so a friend of mine, right, brings in, he says, "Oh, his name's just Abel." Right. And I go, no, like that's just a transliteration in the Greek Bible. And it's just like that's how our English books have it. But I mean, this is like dances with wolves. You know, like, why does he have that name? Because he's dancing with the wolves or whatever. You know, like this name has a meaning, right? And so Cain is the etymology of his name is given right there. It says, "I have purchased or created or whatever a man with the help of the Lord." In Genesis 4:1, and Eve says this, and she uses the verb kana, right, which can mean purchasing, grasping, these kind of things. There's another has a kind of like a homologue, another verb kana, which is spelled differently, that can mean jealousy. And then some people like want to tie it to weapons making, these kind of things. But jealousy and grasping, I think, are core parts to the story. Whenever Abel is referenced, he's always referenced as Cain's brother, possessively. Or it's one of these Torah commentaries by Sarna it points this fact out, right? That Cain is always possessing Abel, never the other way around. The only time Abel possesses something is when it talks about his sheep, and then he gives them up. He gives it up, right? So Cain is someone that grabs onto the world, and he thinks that that God should, and he's the firstborn. He is tiller of the ground, which is exactly what God said they should do. He said, "Go out." We send them out to till the ground, and it said, "Be a slave of the earth," right? And it says he's a slave of the earth. He's exactly what it says that God sent them out to do. He's not doing anything wrong, but he has a wrong idea. And so I think this story is trying to again categorize the world into two different types of people. And so Abel means emptiness. It means I think it could be translated as nihilist, in a very important way, not in a negative sense at all, kind of in the kenosis sense of the emptying of Jesus. Abel is the word that opens up the declaration in Ecclesiastes. It says kol havel, all is vanity, right? You've heard in the King James, or in the NIV, it's everything's meaningless. Or in the Common English Bible, it says havel hevelim is perfectly pointless. Is how it's translated. I think it's a really beautiful translation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so this idea that the world is going for something, or a future eschatology, that it's going to be fixed and it's wrong now, but will be fixed in the future, that it's got a point that it's going to, is contrast to the very common realized eschatology that you find in John and early Christian writings, that the end is already here. You just don't see it. Right. And that is a kind of, there is no point that this is going to. It's already as it should be. Right. It's kind of an end in itself. The moment is an end in itself. And Abel, I think, represents that. Right. Since basically, and I think this has the key to understanding the Cain and Abel story in Ecclesiastes. It says all is Abel, all is vanity, right? But the word is essentially kind of transliterated. All is Abel. It's exactly the same three-letter word. The vowel pointing is added later. This is Havel, right? All is Havel, and this is Havel. This is this guy's name. Like, it's just the same thing. It's just exactly the same word: vanity, emptiness. And that this guy doesn't hold on to this. He gives it up. God's gaze lands on Abel, it says, does not land on Cain. Cain gets angry because of this, I think, because he thinks he deserves. He thinks he has deserving, and that's the wrong idea. And so he asks, why does God's gaze land on Abel? And I think it's just because what Ecclesiastes says, all is Abel. There's no place else for God's gaze to land. And this is a really kind of, it continues this insight into merit and deserving. And says there are people that think that they deserve things in the world, and people that think they have merit, that think that I did this on my own. Right. As opposed to, like in John 5, you have the son that can do nothing but what the Father does. This kind of thing. Right. And there's no agency almost in him. It's almost emptiness and transparency to God, a very low Christology in a way, in parts of John. There's nothing there to him. He's just a sign that points at God. And nobody goes and knocks on the mailbox to see who's in the house. Right. It's just like, right. But I think that's essentially what the church has come. Or like Alan Watts says, the church has Jesus stands in the middle of history and points to the kingdom of heaven, and the church sucks on his fingertip. That kind of thing. That kind of view of stuff. So they've got to completely miss this. They're all just the church of Cain, basically. They're with the church of the graspers that think they deserve, something, right? And I think that's just the main schism here. And the result is there's this there's a parallel, I think, from the 3rd century BC in Taoist literature, from Zhuangzi, who's an early Taoist, and he talks about an empty boat floating on the lake. And he compares it to a boat with somebody rowing it. And he says, if the empty boat hits you, you're not going to get angry. You're not going to yell at it. If a boat with a rower is in it, you're going to yell at them. You're going to tell them to get out of the way. No matter how short your temper, you're not going to get angry at that empty boat. If there's somebody rowing it, though, you're going to be just angry at them. And then when they hit you, you're going to be like, what the heck's wrong with you? And you're just not going to let this go. You think they did it on purpose. And then the poem says, if you can understand the world is all empty boats, including yours, then there's a kind of peace that you bring through life with you. Right. And I think we see that in this story. Right? I think this story is trying to say something very similar, which I think is just a truth that people can come to. I don't think it's a Taoist inherited story. I think that this is a truth of our condition that we can just come to. And that Cain, who is trying to grasp and purchase, and he's essentially like the meritocracy of capitalism, you might say, to bring it into modern language, right? This idea that people deserve what they have, and want to grasp and hold on to it. This is mine. That's what Cain is representing, and that his anger is a product of this wrong idea, this wrong thinking. I don't know if you want to call it Gnostic. It's around like gnosis. It's around thinking. The tree in the Greek Bible is the tree, the gnosis or whatever of good and bad. So it's about thinking. It's about a way of viewing the world that transforms everything about how you relate to it. And so I think there's something very critical here that is completely anti-ecclesial. It's like the church is all about shoving the fruit of the knowledge of good and bad down your throat. They want to essentially, like their communion table, they say, here, eat the fruit of life, but it's They just gave a moralizing sermon about how those people shouldn't be doing that thing. And then they want to feed you something. And no matter what they call it, it's the fruit of the knowledge of good and bad. Right? They're essentially repeating the story as well, as opposed to the fruit of life, which I would say is and in John, I think is the opposite of judgment. It's to see the world through this empowering, but paradoxically hard to understand lens that the will of God controls everything. Like everything happens according to the will. And I think you can read John 1:3 this way, where it says, in the Word, everything everything that is happened was made through the Word, right? Mm-hmm. And I think this is a imperfect verb, and I think it can have I think it match the Qumran language. And I think it can talk about everything that was and continues to be made. It's an ongoing, incomplete process of everything is created. I think I think it's a completely valid and historically grounded translation, but I think it's just impossible for translators to get it because of the weight of tradition and the weight of culture, which even the secular culture really grasping this idea of free will as real cosmology. But I think our time now is kind of, you might say, a second coming of sorts of this idea of the sciences moving us towards or away from that kind of idea of judgment to a more deterministic view. And that they're just, it's just scholarship, the groups here are trying to catch up. Because a lot of modern scholars, they're still thinking in this way. A lot of people like that can't tie those things together. But I think this is really what was going on in the mind of the first century Jews. It's a really cool idea. So Cain and Abel is even an older story, and I think it's trying to capture this fundamental idea, this fundamental dualism of the world as well. And that I think the New Testament people were trying to tie Jesus to Abel, right? Not just the emptiness hymn, but explicitly in the epistle of John. And Cain is referenced but not mentioned by name, other than the city Cana is actually the root verb kana, which is used to describe Cain. And if this is the city of purchasing, the idea that Jesus goes there and kind of like describes the divine wedding, the union of male and female, the bridal chamber and the bridegroom and the bride coming together, and that this male and female union speaking to going back to non-judgment in the same kind of way. And that and so that maybe that's part of what and this is happening kind of in the mind of Cain. And then followed right after that is the temple story, right, where he goes in and purges all the purchasers, all the people that do Cana, that do purchasing, right? In Hebrew, the word Hebrew, and if this is a metaphor for you, your body is this temple. The experience of coming to understand you is to have Jesus, or the idea of Jesus, go into your temple and throw out all the purchasing ideas, and empty it of them, to take you from Cain to Abel, to this kind of thinking, right? And so and then Cain is the first shepherd in the Bible that's killed, and Jesus is the shepherd that's killed. And so there's a lot of really cool parallels between these characters, explicitly called out in the New Testament. So, yeah.
Yeah, that really is profound. So we're in the Garden of Eden, and some traditions have it that was heaven, right? So in the Islamic tradition, they're cast from heaven. And you could think, before there's, meaning put on things, it's just what is, right? It takes on no meaning other than what it is.
Right.
And
so the language would be it's perfect, right? And this is so hard to say. There's not a real good word for this. Like, I think the last thing that Jesus says on the cross in John is translated, it's finished. But the word is tetelestai. And it is the definition. Mm-hmm. The verb itself is conjugated in the perfect tense, the verbal tense. And the verb itself is the definition of the verbal tense, the perfect tense. Like it means the perfect tense. Like, it means this action is ended, right? And that's what the verb means. And it's conjugated in that tense. And it means complete and whole. And I think, but it doesn't have a subject, right? But in the verses before, it says he came to see that all was tetelestai. Panta tetelestai, Ada panta tetelestai. All was now already, or whatever, complete, right? But then it says in order to fulfill Scripture, he says, "I'm thirsty." Right. So he wasn't referring to the things he was fulfilling, right? Because he saw that everything was complete, and then he did something to complete something else, right? And so it wasn't about that. And so translating the word,
Oh,
right? So translating this word as perfect is problematic too. Like if he says the world is perfect, like he doesn't mean like according to your ideal or my ideal. He means in the sense of teleo, this verb that means it's whole and complete. And this idea that the world is whole and complete and not flawed or broken somehow. This doesn't mean there's no suffering or anything, but that the world is, I think a lot of suffering occurs because we think it's broken. And we can't like see why this is happening, right? It's this paradox of letting go of trying to control stuff, right? If what Jesus is saying when the last word on the cross in John 19:30, tetelestai, is the world, which I think goes back to John 1:3, it says all happens through him. He's referring to everything. And that same word panta shows up in 1927. He's saying the whole world is whole and complete. And that is the most profound thing that ever has been said or could be said about the world. It's fundamentally true from a determinist view of things. And as a scientist, it's the first law of thermodynamics. It's the idea of conservation of energy. Everything sums to zero. And if we see there's a gap in energy or explanation, we don't stop searching and say, nope, it just was that thing that did it. No, we keep on digging. And it's a faith statement that drives us to dig until everything sums to zero, until we see how what is whole. And that's when we say, now we know what's going on. That's science. And that's just the faith statement of approaching gaps in knowledge. And it's fundamentally contrast to the idea of free will, which is to just give up on science and stop trying to find a name. So this idea that the world is complete and kind of that faith statement that is natural to flow from the idea that God's will controls everything. I literally think it's the most profound thing that can be said in the world. And I think it blew people's minds. And the people that understood it, I think, like it really drove them to start this community. It really drove them to these ideas of resurrection as this metaphor of seeing the world this way and being the realized eschatology, being brought from death to life that had happened in John, that he talks about. You've been brought from death to life. And the story of Lazarus is a story of this transformation happening, where you all of a sudden see the world this way. And it's compassion inducing. It's empowering to solve problems. It brings you to the people at the edges, because the norms of what should be always drive the systems of power and keep, and kick people off the edges. So yeah, I think that insight is in John is like, it's like how it ends. But when I talk about John, I always like to start there on the cross, the last word. And I think that may even have been an ending of the book at one point, or at least a way that Jesus's entire teaching.
Yeah. And it's interesting how we talk about the multiple endings or like another ending tacked on. But that is a little bit Joannine, isn't it? Like, just like it's finished and I'm thirsty, right? You wonder if that's not original because it fits so much with the theme, right?
Yeah, and then it says he hands over the Spirit.
How's that?
Then it says he lowers his head and hands over the Spirit. It gives up the ghost, but it says literally hands over, using the paradidomi word that's used to describe Judas handing him over, describe Pilate handing him over to be crucified. That same word is used. He handed over the Spirit. And I think that John is trying to talk about a narrative of ownership of the Spirit, and it was at this point handed to the beloved disciple. And so Raymond Brown talks about this, right? About how John likes to play with this idea that this was the handing over of the Spirit. But then it happens again in the next chapter. But I think that we can talk about that. But I think that that's suspect as a later addition. But I think what happened was that originally this was the continuation of the community and how they viewed it, and that there's a parallel here. If the early Christian idea was that Jesus's mother, in a way, was the Spirit, one must be born of the Spirit, and the Holy Spirit is kind of a mother to go with the Father. And the child is the union of male and female in this way, and that this is the kind of Trinity that implies this kind of original state of being, then if the mother is the spirit in a sense, you get John 3 with the you got to be born from spirit, water and spirit. You got to be born by the Holy Spirit. You get the fact that his mother is never named in John, right? She's anonymous also, but he refers to her as woman, right? And so in a way, he's the son of man and the son of woman, in an interesting kind of parallel in the text. And what John has Jesus do is hand his mother over to the beloved disciple, and then hand the Spirit over to the beloved disciple. And so I think there's kind of a parallelism here that maybe an early version was trying to say, this is the way that we continued our community, and the Paraclete is the beloved disciple, and is the continuation of the Holy Spirit working in this community after Jesus died. And this is the story that justifies that and how we got here. Then I think you get something like chapter 21, which seems to be the beloved disciple died unexpectedly. There were rumors about him. They thought that he was going to live till Jesus returned. And so it's already returned. It's already actually moved to a realized eschatology, or to a future eschatology at this point. They think Jesus is coming back. It's not about Jesus here and what is his teaching revealed when you can understand it, how you can achieve life. That's got to happen in the future now. And they're trying to correct an idea that the beloved disciple was going to be here until Jesus returned. And he says, no, Jesus didn't actually say that. He says, if I want him to be here till I return, what's it to you? It's this really weird, kind of way of couching it. He doesn't say, for example, well, what you didn't understand was that the end was already here, and he was here then too, right? It's like the blood. They didn't share realized eschatology language, which is apparent, I think, in earlier versions of people with deterministic, non-judgmental mindsets who think the end is now. And it had shifted to this more popular Pharisaic future eschatology idea that was at Qumran as well, and that the beloved disciple had died. Right. So and it had created a split in the community that they needed to address by adding chapter 21. And I think a couple of things, right? So I think for many scholars, this says that the beloved disciple was a real person who died unexpectedly and created a crisis. Right. And so he was a real biological person, because I think fictional characters don't die unexpectedly and need to have problems like sorted out about sayings about them. And then two, that let's see. This would, if it was unexpected, right, as you can tell by these things. And so this was, maybe they didn't have their chain of transfer of the Spirit like figured out. Like he died and they didn't have like some sort of similar ritual handing over of the Spirit to the next group. And then this feeds into adding things like, okay, well, no, Jesus showed up at the first meeting and he handed over his breath to the disciples gathered in the house after the resurrection. And he said, and then you get this weird, really non-Johannine thing where he says, look, if you want to get rid of sins, it's up to you. If you want to keep them, it's up to you. It's very like suspect. It's like total like power to the church kind of thing. It's not the opening where it says, here's the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world, period. Like it's okay, maybe some sin stays if you disciples want to. It's like totally like power church control thing. And maybe it was added to handle this crisis, that this chain of handing of the Spirit had somehow been messed up and they needed to figure this out and kind of straighten it out. So yeah, I think that yeah, I love John for this, because I think it just talks about shows a real living community that evolved in response to all sorts of different things over time. Yeah, so I think that idea of the handing over of the Spirit and the handing over of the mother to the beloved disciple, that those are a poetic parallelism. Like that's saying the same thing. And it's why he wants to keep Mary or the mother as anonymous in a sense. He's both his mother, just like he has a father Joseph, and his father heaven, and she's both his mother and also the Spirit from which born from above or again kind of thing. In this different way of it is being born to understand. Yeah. So I think that is maybe some of what's going on there towards the end of John, and that maybe this statement that it's all complete and the handing over the Spirit was an initial way of serving this community that had this really just world like shifting idea that they were trying to come to terms with.
Yeah. So with the Garden of Eden, right? So you'd imagine on that day you'll die, right? That you'll no longer be alive. You'll be judging. You're not going to be in the present moment, right? Which is like you're in the past, you're in the future. It's like death, right? So on
Yeah.
that day you will die. So they're they're both true, really. Like a lot of Gnostics would say that the God was the fibber, right? Because
Both
they didn't
serpent
die.
and God are right in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And so then you're judging things. You're not eating from the tree of life. You're not alive. You're
They put on clothes, they feel judged. Like, I mean, this is children run around naked, right?
yeah.
It's like they feel that's what I mean. It's another in the story like indication that this is what they felt. They needed to hide themselves because they felt like not right. Right. And I mean that's just another way of saying that's what that tree means. People want to say it's like, oh, it just means everything or whatever. There's all sorts of ways that people just go around trying to get around what this means. I have a dissertation on this topic from 2018, not mine. I mean,
Mhm.
it's another scholar by I think his name is Nathan French, and he's talking about the idea of interpreting it as moral knowledge, as moral discernment, and judgment, right? And he talks. Okay, there's some scholars here that think it might be this over the last couple hundred years, and he talks about it, and then he says, yeah, but why would anybody want to think of it? Like he ends his section on a rhetorical question, like that seems to just think it's absurd. Like, and I think it's just because he believes free will is real. And like I think a lot of people do, that they just can't even begin to like figure out what the heck that means. Like they can't put their mind in that way of thinking. And so, but yeah, I think there with the fact that they have to clothe themselves is like they're feeling like they're not right somehow. That's what judgment does when we bring it on. When the children are just running around being themselves, dancing like no one's watching. And then we get to a point where we feel like, okay, I'm not fitting into the rules. And I think the separation from God, you can see in the Torah, and it's the central narrative in this way. So like, I think that the Garden of Eden story was a story that was created to try to summarize the Exodus narrative. And I think it was added late to the story. That's why it's in the beginning. Like you write a prologue for a book that tries to forward that tries to summarize this thing. Right? And so the fact that it's not like the main theme in the rest of the Old Testament, like it is for Paul as a major theme, the new Adam and all that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
He's clearly, obviously seen it. We know he had, but I don't think that the Taoist or people knew of it. And so, or they may have had proto versions of it. But I think the Torah narrative has the name of God as I am. And that this is, it's like being or something like that. No, it's just the present tense of the verb to be. It's being right here in what is. You are living in what should be, or I should be. You are living in I could have been. And so you're separated from God in this way. You're separated from I am, which is not a person, a thing. Like it's something like, it's almost like hard to put your mind into that simple like thing of what it is. And so that the Torah narrative itself is, here's manna. You can have as much of it as you want, but if you hang on to it for tomorrow, it rots. He's trying to teach them, I am. Like, say this. This is a prayer. Say God's. That's a way of being right now, right? So it's like, this is the kind of the idea against idolatry. This idea that God is anthropomorphized to tell the story, but it's not like a person that's doing this. Like, it's a more kind of this web of relationships idea and this presentism. This you're trying to grab onto this stuff. You're trying to possess it like Cain. And when you come to understand this, you'll open up. And so I think when Deuteronomy 139 says, only the children that do not know good from bad may enter there, I think that's what it's talking about. It's trying to say only people with this mindset may enter there, and that's really old. And that Jesus was trying to say, my name is like Joshua opposed to Moses, and Moses died in the wilderness. And he said, they come to the boundary of the promised land, and God says, go in there. And he says, well, you can send in spies if you want. And Moses says in Numbers 13, he says, go in and see if it's good or bad. Same as he says, They're using the same phrase that's on that tree. He says, go in and see if it's good or bad. And they go in, they're like, holy crap, we can't do this. We can't do it because there are giants in there. Like, we can't do it on our own, like, because they're saying we have to do this on our own to go in there. And Joshua and Caleb are just like, what do you mean? Let's go. Like they're in a flow state, right? With this idea of God, and that halting and the seeking whether this land was good or bad. That is why Moses dies in the wilderness, and all the rest of them have to. Is because this is another. The world has two sets of people in it, right? There's Cain's and Abel's, right? And the Cain's die in the wilderness, and the Abel's enter paradise, right? And the ones that just consider the lilies of the field, right? And don't grasp for tomorrow. The ones that can live now, they live with I am. And they're with God. They say I am. They're with that sense of living. And they're not with I should be or could have been kind of living, which is all derived from the knowledge of good and bad. I could have been, which indicates the judgment of your past. And you're just riddled with guilt.
Yeah.
And judgment of what you should be and all these norms of how you're broken right now. You're just riddled with stress about these things, right? And then there's a real empowering story up here. People that didn't live in the centers of power. They lived in this liminal area between Babylon and Syria and Egypt, these superpowers, and they were this middle period that was constantly going back and forth. The word Hebrew itself in Hebrew actually means crossover. It means basically liminal space in a way, or it basically means go yeah. So anyway, and the name Joshua, Moses changes his name in that same period with the spies from Hosea to Joshua, which is Jesus. Like the 6th book of the Bible in the Greek Bible is just named Jesus. It's like Joshua, that's the book, right? And so and so the transition, the name Hosea means I save or he saves, like this guy does it, like you do it, like it's up to us. And the name Joshua means no, Yahweh, Yahshua, like Yeshua, Yahweh does the salvation. And so both what his name was and what it became, both very important to this person's identity. And understanding that, believing in the name of Jesus, you could say, is understanding this truth that everything happens according to God's will. And that it's coming to that realization that you're not in control. Neither is that person across from you. That this deterministic realization that this is essentially the narrative of the Torah. It's like extremely old, and the Pharisees, in a way, with their meritocracy and the purchasing of indulgences, you might say, that at the temple, had lost this thread. And the determinism at Qumran was partly way there, though it was more kind of like a Zervanian, Zoroastrian kind of dualism, but still deterministic. But that this Jesus movement was a orthodoxy towards a powerful truth that had been lost in both the kind of Greek, in both the Persian and Greek periods that had kind of come after the Babylonian destruction of their cults, and that those two masters, the Hellenists and the Persians, really had meritocracy and free agency was like core to their philosophy, right? And that Platonism itself is essentially like there are perfect things, and then everything here is a bad version of that. Or like, this kind of idea that the ideals are projected and corrupted by the projection process. And so you have things that are flawed triangles that you draw on a piece of paper. You can never create this ideal, but it exists. And that's what's actually real. And this is all just, shadows on a cave or something. But like what I think Jesus is trying to say, that it rejects all that and says, no, this is not a triangle that I drew on this piece of paper. It's actually just this thing. It's perfectly this, right? And you are one of a kind, right? There's nothing like you, but they want to tell you that you can be judged against something, right? And so I think that's a big theme in John. The word monogenes, that's translated as only begotten often in 3:16 and 1:18, these kind of things. I think the word means one of a kind or unique. Right, so mono meaning one, and genus, like genus and species and phylum, and it means kind. And so
Yeah.
the word, and this is in the lexicon, this is not like me making this up, it means one of a kind. And Bart Ehrman translates it as unique in his stuff. And so this is like seeing Jesus as the prototype of uniqueness, and then seeing the whole world as made up of things that are not comparable, is a philosophy that I think was core to their initial understanding. Not like to be not judged is to be perfectly what you are, not to be a flawed, I don't know, philosopher or something like that, right? It's to be you as you are. You're one of a kind, not many of a kind and flawed according to that ideal. It's total anti-Platonism, right? And so like in Thomas 13, the one where he's mentioned, right? And I think you have this idea that Jesus says, compare me to something, right? And Peter says, oh, you're like, well, you've heard this one. Well, you're a wise philosopher. And then Matthew says, well, you're a great messenger or angel or something like that. And then Thomas says, my mouth can't compare you to anything. And he gets it, right? He gets that he's incomparable, and that's what it means. And now he has become Christ according to Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas's philosophy. He has no longer had Christ as his teacher because he got monogeneous. He got that I can't compare you to something. Like I can't utter it because you're one of a kind thing, which is just anti-Platonism, anti-judgment, anti-categories, all these things. It's a larger philosophy of that kind of naturally derives from determinism, and that goes back to the male-female union stuff in Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas, and these kind of other things that points right back to Eden. I think with the protology that's present in John and in Thomas, there's tons of pointing back to Eden and the creation story. So back to that state of being, where the kingdom of heaven is already laid out on the earth. You can't see it. This is like Luke 17 and the last, second to last Logan and Thomas is it's already here. It's realized. The point is kind of opening your eyes to it, and that's what the being cured of blindness means, right? That's what the blind man's stories are, is to be brought to see this reality in front of you where everything is one of a kind. And then you got Buddhists that like have this piece of trash in front of them and they just say, did you know about this? There's nothing like this. Like there's nothing like this in the entire cosmos. And they're just in this raptured state of seeing this in everybody, like in each person. And I really think people can see this when you sit down with them and you actually think this about them. And you don't think of them as a flawed something, but you see them and you say, there's a story here that explains why this person is perfect as they are and shouldn't be any other way. And I think when you truly believe that and you sit down with somebody, I think it really has a transformational effect on them, as well as that you've already gone through this when you're able to do that, I think. So I think that is that incomparability story is core to the Torah. And I think it really is a thread of Judaism that's essentially lost in both synagogue and church today, where you have very judgmental, kind of moralizing talk that's very, essentially from Augustine on, and from the Pharisees on. It's very, it's very Platonist. It's very their ideals. God is the ultimate ideal. This kind of thing. You need to be like that. So I think that's essentially, it's a real kind of conspiracy theory, right? It's really like, wow, this has always been, there's a thread that you can draw on this all the way through the Torah and into the New Testament. And then you can see that, I think, mostly in John unfold, which is one of the reasons I think it's quite early. Parts of it are quite early, right? Let me dominate the direction we're going here.
Oh yeah, no, maybe eventually we can get into Jacob and Esau.
Yeah,
though, returning to the Garden of Eden, that they eat from the tree, but they really can't know what they're doing because they don't know good and bad. They're kind of flung into it, right? And they really can't not. So it's like, it's saying that, how we say, I think, therefore I am, right? But they clearly were before they thought. So being precedes thinking, right? So you can think without being. I mean, maybe that's what it's saying, right? And then you're flung into the world, right? And you can realize, like, I mean, you were thinking before, but maybe this is judgment, right? And then so like you're viewing yourself as separate from everything else, right? Which is what I think is meant by I think, therefore I am.
Okay.
And I mean, maybe that's setting it straight, right? That you really have being without judging, right? And differentiating yourself. And really, when you start to add meaning to things, like, oh, this person means this. Well, I mean, people can mean things, but like, let's say, like, this happened, that's what this means, right? Where you're putting things onto what is, and it's just not what's so, right? It's not the actual state of affairs, right? And you're imbuing it with meaning. And when you're imbuing it with meaning, it tends to be negative, right? It's almost always negative meaning, right? And I've thought of this
It's not
expression,
just that,
meaning.
it turns things in the world into means to ends. I mean, meaning means it's for something, right? And so now instead of seeing a thing as an end in itself, as seeing this lily in the field as an end in itself, now it's a gift for your girlfriend in the future or something like that, right? It's now not that thing. You're not even seeing the thing anymore. You're seeing this
Yeah.
future idea, right? So this is kind of what the nihilism idea is. The beauty of this view of the world is that it turns everyone into an end in themselves. It's almost paradoxical, right? I think we think of free will as making a person an end in themselves, or they're kind of like a beginning in themselves, you might say. They create like they're the source of things. But I think that this view makes people and things into ends in themselves. That's the idea of meaninglessness, and I love that translation in the NIV of the book of Ecclesiastes. That meaning points away from where you are. To have a point, if there's a point to something, that means it's pointing out there. But the reality doesn't have a point, it doesn't have a meaning, because it doesn't point past itself. It doesn't point to anything, right? And meaning has this weird effect of even the idea that we should give meaning to the world. Like all that does is turn people into tools, like for you to get somewhere, or like they're now means to ends. They are a meaning that gets you towards some other state of being. That's the reason that they're here. They're here for that reason. They're not an end in themselves, which I think is a really beautiful way of viewing it. It's really a compassionate and empowering idea that is hard to stick with, because everybody's constantly telling you need meaning or that kind of thing. And so nihilism in this sense, I think is a very positive thing. Like, it's a very beautiful thing that humanizes people in a lot of ways. Instead of emptying them and treating them as just something for you to use to get somewhere towards some end state. Instead, you're here with them as an end in themselves, which I think is maybe that's might have been some of what you're getting at with the think therefore I am stuff. I don't. I think that's how I struggle with this story of meaninglessness and the value of it. And it's all these things get into paradoxes, because, like, okay, so are you supposed to get to this non-judgment state because it's good to get there? Like, this kind of thing. No, that's right. So I think that is core to the ideas of grace, right? And so like works versus grace, right? This idea that you can work for it, towards it, or you just, for no reason at all, get it, right? And that it sounds that different, sounds just terrible to someone who thinks that there's free will in the world. But it sounds completely unjust, and people have to justify this. And they have all these theodicies, and they're all based around free will. But it's kind of like a meta point on top of this, that if you understand what that means and why works don't make sense and why grace makes sense, if you understand this in these terms, you got it. Like, all of a sudden grace has just landed on you in this sense, right? And that's just what that dichotomy means. It's not something like unfair or limited, or that, I mean, you could say that it is. There are people that go through their whole lives and don't ever get this. They don't get this point. But like, I think that grace is essentially the fact that it's not up to you, and that's essentially scientific determinism, or however you want to view it. And so this goes in my interpretation of the 153 fish. I think it's I've seen that you like that story, and I love the story too. I think it perfectly captures this. And so it starts off and Peter says, I'm going to go fishing, and people say, okay, I'll follow you. And it's night and they don't catch anything, right? I think it's a polemic against Peter that you follow Peter, you're in darkness, you don't catch anything. You don't, the idea of disciples, right? And it's not until dawn, which is kind of a liminal period where kind of like dark and light are kind of together. It's kind of male and female idea, that Jesus appears and says, cast your net over there. And they do, and they get all these fish, right? And then they drag it behind the boat as they come to the shore. And used in this narrative is this technical term in John. It's a Greek word, helkuo, and it means dragged against your will, to be dragged against your will. And it's used to describe, in John 6, it says, those who will come to Jesus must be dragged by the Father. It uses this word. Like, you don't get to choose. It's like used to, I think in Acts or something, to talk about being dragged out of some temple and tossed out, basically. So it's the idea that you get to be brought to Jesus against your will, basically. That's the only way you get there, is to be dragged by the Father. And this narrative shows up, all people be drawn to Jesus, using the same word in John. So it shows up 5 times in John. And in this fishing story, there's 2 different Greek words for dragging that are used. One, when they were dragging it but couldn't pull it into the boat. And so, because Jesus didn't command them to do that, they're not following God's will in the sense. So they're using this different dragging word. And then when Jesus says, haul them, bring the fish here, Peter helkuos and drags them. So whenever Jesus says drag them in, they use this technical word, and otherwise they use a different one. And then the number of fish were 153. And that is the Hebrew gematria for sons of God. So which is the children of God, basically, that word pair, B'nai Elohim, which shows up in Genesis 6 and Job 1 and 2. And so the letters in Hebrew sum up to 153. And this is, so one of these things, like this whole triangle number deal and all this kind of stuff, where like one of the criteria I like for this is that it's got to make sense in John, right? And I don't know what Pythagoreanism really has to do in John, this kind of thing. But I know Augustine was fighting for this one and this kind of stuff. And it's fun. I'm a mathematician, and so I like that as one of the initial things I was gravitating to. But I mean, this is a deterministic interpretation. You don't get to come to Jesus unless God commands you, and Jesus commands, and they use the dragging language, just like John 6 has and John 12, I think. And then you have the large fish in the net are children of God, which is if you look back to John 1, 12 and 13, God empowers, Jesus understanding empowers you to become children of God, but not by blood or by the will of the self or the will of other people, but only be able to be born by God into this role as a child of God. Right? So there's a kind of determinism here. It's not up to you or other people. It's up to God. And when they go out fishing with Peter and Jesus is not there, they don't catch anything. When Jesus comes in and commands, they pull in children of God, 153. Right. And so this idea that it cares a lot about Hebrew, there's a Semitic mind behind here that would have cared a lot about numbers and these kind of things. And that, there's 7 I am statements, 7 I am the statements, and they're, this that they care about this topic. So I don't know, it seems like a solution, right? that is both supported in an interpretation of John. It's also uses a term that's in John. Some of these other gematria stories about, I think one guy presented this in a 1960s paper, and he said, yeah, but I don't like that one. It's Church of Love. And he has some sort of like way of summing up that word to equal 153. But I think children of God is just simple and is a term used probably early in the church, and then later was kind of like, okay, yeah, but not really like Jesus. Yeah, he's only begotten. You're like a child of God, but it's like in quotes. It's our Father, yeah, but it's really like Jesus's Father. And you don't like become like Jesus. Like Jesus stays as the mediator. But it's more like the Thomasine or what I think is the Johannine, and this comes in many. And I think John and Paul are early in this sense that they talk about people as children of God, and it's rare. Maybe it's in the Beatitudes, people become children of God, that kind of thing. But it's not really a theme after that. Kind of later when the church, I think, wants to kind of okay, no, we got to control who gets in. Inside the St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, Peter's throne is right there in front of heaven, and he gets to decide who comes in. He can't have everybody being like Jesus, kind of thing. And so you get this shift away from everyone as children of God, and that you can become a child of God like Jesus. You get a shift towards just kind of a relational thing instead of an identification thing. And that necessarily shifts you away from, I think, this kind of universalizing take on early Christianity. So that's one of the ways that I date John early is the fact that there's this kind of, you also, I think in John 10, the King James adds a definite article in front of child of God. The Jews accuse him of making himself a child of God in the text, but the King James adds a definite article. And it's fun, like in some of the King James traditions, it's in italics, right? And so people come to think that means like intensified, like the child of God. But italics in the King James just means it's added by the translator. It's not in the text. And so the italics actually mean it's not actually there, but people think it's actually emphatic. And so, but the idea that he was making himself a child of God, and this was, we all can, or a son of God, and we can all be children of God according to the kind of like what the faith is in the opening of John, is something that's very democratizing and not really lending towards normative control of church stuff that needed to eventually happen to make a Tower of Babel, that we have today, kind of thing. That's constantly breaking, that even witnessed in the Joannine epistles and in John itself. You can see schisms. There's the command to love itself is just there, I think, as a response to the fact that people weren't loving, and that needed to be added in. That's a kind of like the 15, 16, and 17 chapters are in a way a witness to even just constant division because of this idea. So cool. So I think the 153 fish might be that. And that might have been one of the early, and it kind of goes with this determinist narrative, if that's what John was thinking. So it's kind of part of this, but it's a theme in John, the children of God, and that these fish are disciples. Children of God is part of the group. They're the large fish that are mature and have come to understand this. And so I think it's got its own legs beyond just this deterministic interpretation as well. But I think that's cool. So there, as you know, there are tons of other interpretations, but I think that one does it for me, at least.
Yeah. So with Jacob and Esau, do you see that as something like a retelling of Cain and Abel?
Well, maybe. I think there's a lot of anti-meritocracy stuff in there as well. And this idea that Esau was his father's favorite and was firstborn and, was doing all the hard work and kind of stuff and was the manly man kind of thing. The one you would think would be the inheritor, would have all the deserving, but doesn't get it. He doesn't get it. Jacob gets it. Right. And so again, the names are interesting. So Esau is his name means kind of like reddish, kind of like so he becomes the people of the Edomites, and that is basically the same word as like Adam. It's the earthy word. And Jacob's name is really interesting. And there's this cool. So this Rabbi Mark Samath from New York City, he has a New York Times op-ed about how maybe I think it's like, is God transgender? Is the spicy title, right? But I think it's this idea of male-female union kind of thing again. This bridal chamber image. But you do get a lot of like masculine, feminine imagery. So Esau is big, muscly, hairy, hunter, all this stuff. Jacob is his mother's favorite. Is like says he's perfect, and he's cooking in the tent. He lives in tents, is what it describes him, and he's cooking the soup. He's doing this task in the house, which is normally for women to do, and so he's got all these kind of feminine characteristics, and his name basically means like trickster, right? And I think it's a really cool idea. Joseph Campbell would often talk about the idea that Yahweh is a trickster. He's the one that when you're building this big tower to heaven and he just comes down and wrecks it. Like, what's that about? Like, and the word Jacob means heel grabber, and when he tricks his brother by literally putting on his brother's skin more, like transforming into a kind of more masculine shape by putting on the sheepskin and taking on the shape of his brother, he essentially like transforms into this masculine aspect and tricks Isaac into giving him the blessing. And that this act of trick, and then Esau says, well, doesn't he have the best name for what he's done here? He's just lamenting that he's lost his, and Yahweh obviously goes along with this. And this guy becomes the identity of the Hebrew people. Like Jacob is Israel, right? I mean, he is Israel. Like if you're gonna create a character like Uncle Sam that defines your nation, like, I mean, you're gonna put your identity into this person. And so I think it's really interesting that these people in this liminal space, right? And often there's a kind of moral nihilism that goes along with the trickster. They don't seem to like follow the rules of right and wrong. And they often are liminal, mercurial, they move between heaven and earth. They kind of, Mercury is the union of heaven and earth in a way. It's the messenger that moves between them. And you can see Jesus has a lot of these same images, and Jacob has the Jacob's ladder kind of image between heaven and earth, and Jesus, and at the end of John 1 has, you'll see the angels ascending and descending. I'm the union of heaven and earth, and he's, water and blood, and this kind of the union of earth and sky kind of motifs through all this, that this is like language of liminality and of in-between spaces, and that Jacob represents this kind of thinking, this kind of way of being, and that they had to get by on their wits amidst these superpowers, just living on this hill with a spring that fed water to them. And they had to like figure out how they would, pit one against the other and all this kind of stuff, these powers, and do this to survive. But that there's also something fundamentally important about tricksters and about the kind of truth that they reveal about the world and its nature. And that it's not that they're evil, though they get painted as Satan kind of later, but that they are tapped into a truth. I think that's this truth about non-judgment, and I think, yeah. So I think you can see that in the later stories of Jacob, the fact that he wrestles with God and is renamed, and he goes from being like the father of the Hebrew tribes into the kind of like the bride of God in a way that Israel becomes like in a bridal relationship with God and the prophets. So you have a kind of like male-female union in a character. God touches him on his hip, which is not hip, and has a kind of like transformation of him into this new persona. And maybe there's a kind of like reunification of male and female in this image that might have a kind of protology to it. So yeah, I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff in that narrative. But the big one is that this is there's clearly tricksterism, and there's a lot of scholarship on this idea going on. There's clearly tricksterism going on. You don't want to, I'm not presenting this as the idea that, Jewish people are tricksters and this kind of thing. I think it's actually a beautiful element to this, and a truth that this is tied into that's really grounded in something that we need more in the world. And I think that it's just really cool. It's really hard to interpret this story as a hero story, like a virtuous hero story. It's really just, I think it's impossible. I mean, I don't mean that. People do it, obviously. But I think that you have to ignore a lot about it. And in a way, the text says he is, when it's describing in Genesis 25, it's describing the two of them. It says he is Tom in Hebrew. And this is a word that's synonymous with shalom, and it means perfect. And if tetelestai were translated, and it is often the last word from John, that teleo is translated, it's often translated into this verb in the Septuagint. So we have the Hebrew and the Greek, right? If you look at that word in Hebrew, it's often translated as teleo, or whole and complete and perfect in the Septuagint. And so I think that there's a tie between these ideas of what Jacob was, and so there's something whole about him that others didn't get. So maybe it is a kind of dichotomy. I don't think it's as violent as, I think it's more like from a time when Edom was a neighbor to Jerusalem, or to Judea and Israel. And they were trying to describe, okay, these are our neighbors. They're like our brothers. And here's the difference between us. And this is how we understand ourselves from them, kind of thing. And why we believe we carry the blessing in a way. And so it kind of stops there, and it stops at Jacob, and he's the father of the Jewish people. It doesn't like then, split down, and maybe Benjamin is the preferred one, or whoever, or Joshua is, or not Joshua, Joseph. And it's all of them. They all have it now. These are all the people of Israel that receive the blessing. So it stops. It anchors right there on this person with this identity that's been written into the story, in a way that I think is really, in itself. I think a lot of people want to read Genesis kind of like leaving it open end. I think it might be a kind of closed story in a way. This is how these people identify as the chosen of God, and it's not because they deserve it. They're chosen when other people deserve it in most people's ways of thinking. And so there's a kind of anti-desert built into this narrative of who is chosen. And so I think there's a lot of that to the Jacob and Esau story that's often just lost in the translation. His name means trickster. Like, you can translate it very well as that. And I think that's really cool, right? Given the archetype of trickster and how they live in liminal spaces. Yeah. So that's some of my thoughts on Jacob and Esau. Does that make any sense?
Well, yes. This thing about being touched on the hip, if I'm reading between the lines, you're saying that he was touched on the privates and transformed.
Right. So in Exodus 1, it says Jacob goes into Egypt and brings 70 people the fruit of his hip. The fruit of his hip. He uses the same word. And so it's frequently used in this way to describe. It's used in the Judges this way. It's used in a variety of places to describe the production of the loins. Like, these children came out of his word that's translated as hip. And so, yeah, so you could read it something like that. This is not with our modern puritanical mores ideas. But like that, there was something gender bending or sexual bending going on in this. I don't know what it was, but something. Like, so it's not just his hip. Like, there's something else.
Yeah. So we're speculating that God turns his privates into women's privates. Is that what we're thinking?
So he doesn't take the name Israel. No, I don't think that. I don't think that. Like, I don't think the story doesn't say anything like that. But he doesn't take the name Israel until after Rachel dies and all of his children have been born. So after he's done playing the role of father, he takes the name of Israel. And it says Israel walked on, basically, after he names Benjamin and after Rachel dies. And so, like, I think that there's something about a role shift happening that moves towards more a kind of like whether it's the bride of God image or moving towards a kind of more mothering spirit. And I think it kind of reflects the kind of male-female image of the divine in the way that, like, creation starts in darkness as a birthing narrative almost in Genesis 1. Or just I think when the image of God is labeled as male and female, I think that's what the image of God was, is this idea of the relationship between, right, that male and female was this. And so there's something to that image that's being discussed in Jacob and Israel. And I don't think it's about, like, sex organs or anything like that. Maybe it's something to do with that. When it says he walks away after being touched on his hip, it says it uses this verb sela, which is the same thing that's used to describe it's related to the noun that's used to describe the rib. It's usually translated rib, but if you see it as like the second half of Adam, if he was cut in half, because the word everywhere else is translated as side. This is a very common interpretation of the thing, and not as rib, but as two halves of the same person. There's something about him kind of favoring a side or something like that as he walks away. There's something about sides going on in what happens as he walks away from being touched in the hip. And it's using that same verb that's derived from the noun that's used to describe half of something. Like, it's another half going on in here somehow. Now, I don't know what they meant by it, but it feels like the language, I don't know what they actually meant by it or whatnot, but the language seems to be indicating something beyond, I think, what most interpretations want to put in there. It's something to do with these images of God and some sort of idea of completeness, and that it's kind of in some ways related to this idea of but it gets I think dropped out in a lot of the translations, both the ancient translations and the modern ones.
Yeah.
because this idea had shifted and been lost in a lot of
Yeah.
ways.
So along those lines, Logion 114 in Thomas.
Right. Make Mary
Do you
female.
do you have
Or
any
make
thoughts
Mary
on that?
male.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I mean, you have this idea of in Logion 22, right? The idea that when the male and female are made into one, kind of matches the Galatians 3:26. So you're no longer Jew nor Greek, slave or free, nor are we male and female. It says like it says Jew nor Greek. They use the or word, and then it says male and female. No longer are we male
Interesting.
and female. So it uses a different kind of concept. And I think a lot of people think this might have something to do with this kind of bridal chamber idea of the non-judgmental state being a kind of androgyne state in a way, and that the pronouns in the languages are male dominant, and so something that is both male and female can be described by a male pronoun, even in a singular case. So like just in the beginning, you might say that night and day are feminine. There's some argument over this, but Lila in Hebrew is like the night, and Yom is day, right? And but then together they're referred to as Yom, day. Right? It says one day in Genesis 1:5. Right? But they're equal parts, male and female, in this male labeled thing. And the head of it is in darkness, which is this feminine element, right? And the second half is light, which is this kind of masculine element to it. And so I think that is part of the God creates light and darkness, all of it kind of thing. And God starts in darkness. This is not Zoroastrianism. God starts in darkness. It is not God starting in all light. Mm-hmm. It's darkness. Like it says that like 3 times in the opening verses. And so, yeah, I think that's a big difference there. So the pronouns keep you from saying there's no like, especially in Hebrew, there's no neuter pronoun. Excuse me. And so I think you wouldn't get you can't say it other than with a male pronoun. And so I don't think that it means that you cannot be female. And I think it means the male and female are made into one, which is what it says in Thomas. And so that's what they're talking about. And maybe it's a rebuke of Peter on exactly this point. Does that make sense?
So basically, well, so it's like if the woman can be made man, so any woman that makes herself a man will inherit the kingdom of God, right?
So I would say it's the way that it's worded there is wonky. And it may be like a translation artifact from moving into like from maybe some early Semitic, whatever the languages were. It's been translated 2 or 3 times to get to what we have in Coptic, and maybe the languaging here, or maybe it is just kind of like anti-feminist, But I think that the idea is not. I mean, Jesus is like, he doesn't mean he's gonna like give her male genitals. I don't think there's no like that idea. I think it's like, well, let me tell you what this means. And he didn't, we don't have that, what this means. He's just gonna make her male in a way where, and so there's a kind of both are there, male and female together. He's not gonna change her from being female biologically. He's going to have a transformation in thinking that I think in Thomas itself is very clearly about going back to this androgyne state, this protological state of male and female as one thing in Adam. And it's neither male nor female, but it's both, right? And that's the non-judgmental state. It's after the division happens, then this eating happens, and then the suffering happens. And so to go back to a state that's androgyne. And so I think a lot of this points to the androgyne hypothesis, which is in text at the time, that it points back to this idea of basically that idea of the child of God as androgyne, as the original state of creation in non-judgment, as not even having a moral compass, because all of that compass always points out of Eden, right? It's being in that state, I think. So it's not getting rid of the female half and making it only the male half, but making it kind of like protological Adam, which is both in one. And that's where you get the Thomas 22, once the male and the female are made into one, then you may enter the kingdom of heaven, kind of thing. But it might be that 114 is from a later time when this kind of idea was lost and monastics were just like, no, women are terrible. And I think there's a big thing to have to do with this, right? Because I think there is a shift from the kind of yin yang image of a feminine as the darkness and as the soil and of the earth and of black, right? And so in Song of Songs 1:5, the King James has translated, I am black but beautiful, right? Like in spite of being black, I'm beautiful. And Martin Luther King says, but wait till we can say I'm black and beautiful. And really, there's only the fact that the King James came out like within 5 years of the slave trade starting, like in 1611. That this kind of, and it always has been, I think, this idea of demonizing the darkness since, well, not always has been, I would say, but like even in Palestine, the people that worked outside were seen as lower class had darker skin because of suntan, and the people that were able to stay inside had lighter skin because they didn't have to do this work outside, and so it became a symbol of class there too. But you have this dualism in Qumran and in John of light and dark being ignorance so light being awareness and darkness being ignorance, more or less. It's not a moral dualism. It's about people who don't get it and people who do get it. The spirits are truth and error in the epistles, and those are the same spirits in Qumran, right? And so this idea that light and darkness there are meant as a metaphor for getting it versus not getting it. You can see how it's a mixed metaphor. When John 1:5 has like God is all light and there's no darkness in him, that just completely contradicts like the opening of the Bible, where it's all darkness and God is right. That's like the birth point for the universe from God, right? That's this mixed metaphor has really started to screw up things, and you can see maybe Zoroastrianism and the light dark strong dualism there had a part to do it. So the Isaiah says we reject this dichotomy, but then you see already in that verse in 45:7 that they say, I make light and darkness. I create peace and evil. And already the poet has put them parallel with darkness being evil and light being peace. So they've already kind of in their literature started to develop this idea. And the consequence of this is the demonization of the feminine. And so it's not, I don't think I think this happened obviously. And that darkness being mixed up in this metaphor, which I think was initially trying to say Jesus is revealed as God on Passover, which is at the equinox when light and dark are perfectly balanced. He's born whenever this came in the solstice, which is the depth of darkness, which is the feminine. And they were trying to like reclaim these images. But then the metaphors got mixed, and then darkness just got associated with ignorance and evil. And then so did women, because women are the dark womb of creation. Right, the spirit of God is feminine and hovers over the earth, right? And so, as I think you can draw a lot of lines to modern day problems with this language issue. And Martin Luther King did. He said he has a whole like list of how there's like 100 some odd synonyms for black, and they are all, and 60% of them are negative. And there's 80 synonyms for white, and all of them are positive. And it's just built into our language this problem that results in us having a contentious relationship to the earth. Right, and we say this is the dark stuff. This is the feminine, the earth, and it's but it's been demonized in our language. It's been demonized because of these metaphorical problems in John, and the person of color we have a strained relationship with today. I think for similar reasons, because we've demonized the darkness. It's not beautiful. It's not black and beautiful. It's black but beautiful.
Yeah, and so we're not saying that the original was I am black and beautiful. It's always been I'm black but beautiful.
No, I think the Hebrew is fine being I am black and beautiful, and I think it was originally celebrating the feminine. And she then says right in the next line, the sun has caught its gaze on me. The light, the male, is associated with the light, and the woman with the dark. It's a very yin yang kind of dualism, right? So in Numbers, you have the daily sacrifice to Yahweh happens at dusk and dawn. There's two of them, right? It happens right there where light and dark are crashing together. Like dawn and dusk are kind of a bridal chamber, like in the day and the time on the calendar, for these two principles. And I think that was an older theology for God that got lost in this light dark dualism that came into that is still dominates Christianity today, right? And I think this bringing Jesus to earth and having like the spirit indwell in flesh is trying to address exactly this problem in a lot of ways. So you think God is entirely transcendent. It's just light. But there is an eminence that has always been crucial to God, but has been lost. And the like incarnation is pointing this out. It's like trying to scream at us that like there's this problem in your theology, and this is it. And then they lost it again, like almost right away. Like this Jesus movement tries to bring God to ground, and say, and you're all this. You're all children of God. You just got to see it, and then it almost immediately gets lost. Like it immediately evaporates. And I think there's reasons why, but that's a major problem. And I think you can see that in the text, and you can see this evolution. And maybe that's part of. So even if you don't want to be generous with Thomas 1:14 and say it's trying to like talk about an androgyne state, it may be a later addition, like many scholars think, from a period where this demonization of the darkness had occurred, and God is all light and this kind of stuff, and it was added to the collection at that point by people who didn't really understand this original male-female union within God, which is clear in like Gospel of Philip and in other places in the text. In this bridal chamber, God is the union of male and female, not male or female. There's a kind of like maybe the God is love stuff could come from that. I don't know. So yeah, I think that's that. Thomas, I love Thomas. Maybe that's what's going on behind 1:14.
Yeah, with the whole skin color thing, it's I mean, in religion, I don't know if they ever say anything bad about dark skin. I can't think of anything in the Bible. But in the Hindu tradition, the inhabitants of heaven have very dark skin because it's so bright, it darkens their skin, right? So if you spend enough time in heaven, your skin will be very dark because the sun is so, or the light is so brilliant, right?
I hadn't heard that. That's cool.
How's that?
I hadn't heard that. That's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the light dark there I know is the Shiva Shakti dynamic, where you have the light and dark. It's a very male female transcendence and eminence element to it as well, or the Kali aspect, the dark aspect. Yeah, so it's interesting. The frankincense and myrrh. Frankincense in Hebrew, the word is just Lebona, where we get the name Lebanon from, and it means white. And so frankincense is basically just, the Hebrew word is just white stuff, and myrrh is dark brown. It's like a dark earthy tone, like the Edom tone, the like soil color, as close as you get to black at the time, right? And so you can see the gift of frankincense and myrrh as a kind of like a light and dark union in this sense. And if you look back in the Torah, there's an oil, a chrism oil, that's based on myrrh. And it's supposed to go on the stuff, and then that's like the eminence component. And these altars are made of gold, so you have your gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So the primary component is myrrh in this oil that goes on the priests and on the surfaces. And then there's a powder made of, so it's made of myrrh and cinnamon and other like brownish stuff. And then there's a powder made of frankincense mainly and salt, so these white things, and sprinkled around the powder of transcendence in a way. And it's this is kind of like, I think this was from a period when this element of darkness and element of lightness were seen as kind of like a part of this union inside of God. And that the gold, frankincense, and myrrh were gifts that were meant to kind of try to harken back to this conception of God as transcendent and eminent, and not just transcendence. And that you see in like Ezra and Nehemiah, the word myrrh just drops out of a lot of the rituals, and there's only frankincense. And so I think in a way that kind of absence of darkness in a lot of these places can be seen as a kind of negation of, or a negative kind of shift towards Ezra and Nehemiah being the ones sent back by Cyrus the Persian to rebuild the temple, and be under the influence of Zoroastrianism in a way. So I think it's kind of, you can almost see, I think, a shift away from darkness to a kind of light-based theology happening in the Second Temple period. But I can't. Nothing comes to mind where the darkness itself is demonized from my studies that I can see.
Say again?
Nothing comes to mind of where the
Yeah.
darkness is directly demonized. I think that verse in Song of Songs 1:5 is the feminine is darkness and she is black and beautiful. I mean, there's no there's no basis for translating that as I think NRSV has and it's just the older stuff sticks with or but as a conjunction. So
yeah. And then when it comes to there's the debate over the skin color of Jesus, right? I've heard the argument that I've not read it, but I've heard that in some of the pseudo-Clementines, that the post-resurrection Jesus is they make a point to say his skin is white. And which would imply, like, if you're saying, well, after the resurrection, his skin was white, would imply that it wasn't before, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's just interesting to put that maybe a darker skin before is what they're saying.
I think that the resurrection events in John happen at dawn and dusk. Like, so I think Mary Magdalene comes in the night, and then the events happen at dawn. And then I think they come to the disciples in the evening at dusk. I think there's this layer in John. So in chapter 1, the first two disciples say, where do you dwell? And he says, come and see. And then the text says it was 4 p.m., or it was the 10th hour. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a liminal period. And I think that essentially it's a metaphor, right? So that Jesus dwells here. So Josephus says that between 3 and 5 p.m. was when they slaughtered the lamb for sacrifice. But also, and so this is right then. John the Baptist had just said, the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. Boom. And then at 4 p.m., which is when it's sacrificed. And John wants to put the meal there on the day of preparation and the crucifixion at this time as well. And so they really want to hammer, I think, home this image. But I also think the Jewish day ends at 6 p.m., right? And so in a way, he dwells at the end of the day, which is kind of at the end right now, all the time. This is where he dwells, metaphorically, right? He dwells at 4 p.m. or at 4 to 6 p.m., the end of the day, right? Which is kind of like realized eschatology in a way. The end is here. And this is where Jesus dwells. Everybody else doesn't dwell there. Everybody else dwells, waiting for the end to come. But Jesus dwells at the end, right? And that's realized eschatology in John, I think. That is so to me, this seems like a layer before the light dark dualism comes in, right? Or something like that, or it's coming from a source that is not kind of affected terribly by this light dark dualism that seems to be elsewhere in John. There seems to be this metaphorical tension. They want to use the liminal dawn and dusk, really solidly Jewish ideas, and then they want to, like, the idea of atonement happening at Yom Kippur, which is opposite to Passover on the calendar, both at the equinox points where there's this light and dark balance, and then you have and so there's this kind of baked in, because I think it's ancient, this light dark liminality, this union in God, and then it's in conflict in the New Testament and in the later Torah or the later Tanakh. It's in conflict with the light dark dualism that's been inherited from the post-Babylon philosophy that kind of like started creeping in. And so I think you can see that in John, that tension where they want, and they may not, who the author may not even been directly aware of this, or it may be a couple authors, and one was like trained in Qumran or the Dead Sea Scrolls community, and the other one was trying to push this bring light and dark together, transcendence and eminence together. The logos becomes flesh, not just transcendence, like God is both. Was trying to bring this idea in, and then the light dark came on top of that, and then caused the division and misdirection, you might say, or confusion. They're not wrong, right? It's not that the light and dark is trying to say ignorance and people that got it and people that didn't in John, I think. People that understand the truth and people that are in error. And that and so it's not like wrong. It's just the metaphor that's trying to be used. It's obviously a metaphor. They're in the light and the darkness and all this kind of stuff. He doesn't mean photons, right? And he's talking about the metaphor. And it's like, so that they're wielding it for a purpose. And I get it. I think that dualism is neat, but just because they ended up inheriting this language of light and dark, it's caused problems. So I'm not saying that the text is in error. It's just, it's problematic. And it's like they're just, the symbols are banging up against one another.
Yeah.
Cool. One thing I like is the blood disciple. I know you've talked about some of that, and you're into that too.
Yeah.
I think it's Thomas. I think it's Thomas the Apostle. I think there's a solid argument for that one.
Okay.
I'm with James Charlesworth on this. That I kind of extend his argument. I think it's really kind of, it's another one of these things of where the translators they kind of, so at the end when Thomas makes the declaration at the end, my Lord and my God, right? Jesus essentially says, well, the translation depends. It says, have you believed because you have seen? It's like this rhetorical rebuke in a way. And they put a question mark on it, though there's no question mark there's no punctuation in the Greek. There's no question word in Greek in the sentence. The NIV translation has a period. You have believed because you have seen. Blessed are those who have believed who have not seen. Right. And so, but I think a question mark is fascinating because it just captures this doubting Thomas negative image. And it's just in there because of that. It's not there because of the Greek implying it. It's this larger interpretation thing. And so everybody in this chapter has believed because they have seen. And it says it. It says it. You have seen it, and it says they have seen and believed. They've seen and believed, saw and believed, saw and believed. It happens all, like for every group, they saw and believed. And then Thomas sees and believes, just like everybody else. There's nothing separate. There's nothing negative about what happened. And so I think what's happening is Thomas is standing on stage with Jesus, and the spotlight is on the two of them. And the book is coming to a close at the end of chapter 20. And the whole thing has been trying to create an argument for how the beloved disciple is here to convince you, because the reader has not seen these events, and the text wants to bring them to believe. So Jesus says to Thomas, and he's kind of like turned his head to the middle distance, right? And he's kind of like talking both to Thomas and the audience. This guy believes because he has seen, and he's not easily convinced by the disciples who he first, at the first meeting, came and told him, and he said, I won't believe this until I can see him. So this guy is not easily convinced, and he was convinced. And Jesus says he saw it and believed it. And then he turns to the reader and he says, blessed are those who can believe without seeing. Right. And so in that way, the like an early edition of the gospel closes out with the witness, like stamping the end of it. Right. And so and I like, so James Charlesworth brings up this other this argument that you ask yourself, why wasn't Thomas at the first meeting of the disciples? So he's explicit, like the whole chapter 20 has the meeting with Mary Magdalene, the first meeting with the disciples. Thomas wasn't there. And that's when Jesus gave the breath for the Spirit to continue the ministry. And Thomas missed out on this, did he? Did he miss out on this? So what is he not in? So there's a lot of conflict hypotheses that say that Thomas and the joining community are in conflict on this point. But why wasn't he there, right? So I think there's a lot of worries about purity in John. There's the stone jars for purification. They wanted to bring Jesus down, so they didn't go in because it took I think Pilate's or something's because they didn't want to be impure for. So a lot of talk about purity, the washing of the feet at the supper. A lot of this discussion of purity in John. So which is a big thing pre-70 there. But so what happens is the beloved disciple and Peter rush to the tomb, and they enter into the tomb. Somebody that cares about purity is going to know that when you enter a tomb, you're unclean for 7 days. It's only after 8 days that you're able to go back and be with people. And that night, after they go into the tomb, Jesus appears to the disciples, but Thomas isn't with them. And then it says, 8 days later, Thomas is back with them and Jesus shows up. And so the idea would be that if Thomas was the beloved disciple, he was going through a period of ritual cleaning
Mhm.
for 7 days. And then after 8 days, which is when it would have been over, the text says Jesus appears to them with Thomas there. And then he makes the declaration. Right. So maybe, and so I think that's a pretty fun argument that, right. And then you say, well, was Thomas cut out of the breath? And then you say, well, what I was talking about earlier, if the Spirit was handed over to the beloved disciple at the cross, and Thomas was the beloved disciple, and he received the Spirit at the cross, and he was the primary witness for this community, period. And this thing about all the disciples getting the breath, well, that's like later. That's later, like, okay, yeah, I get it. Everybody, all the, we got to get rid of all this division. All those apostles are dead. We need something that unifies these strands. We can't have this Petrine or this East-West Petrine Thomasine division anymore. So all of them got it. It wasn't so originally Thomas served John served a community of Thomasine Christians, and he received the Spirit directly at the cross. And then the next chapter is about him having this extreme witness and being the witness that stamps at the end of the book. The ultimate declaration comes out of Thomas's mouth. And then, and then there's a bunch more to this. The idea that in Thomas, those 3 words that in the Gospel of Thomas that he receives in response to saying, I can't compare you to anything in Thomas 13. I don't know if you're familiar with that, where we had gone through where Jesus says, compare me to something. And he says, I can't compare you to anything. And then Jesus gives him 3 special words. Well, there's a very similar scene that happens at the meal. And Peter says something and Jesus rebukes him. Philip says something and Jesus rebukes him in John. And then Thomas says something. Jesus gives him extended teachings and then says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Gives him 3 words. Right. Yeah. And so this is only to Thomas at the meal. And in a similar way, Thomas says, we don't know where you're going at the meal. So in a similar way, he says, how can we know the way? And then Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life, that kind of thing. But he professes an ignorance that's not rebuked, but met with more teaching in John 14 at the beginning of that chapter. And so maybe there's a parallel there too. But it's real interesting. I think that I think it's a compelling argument, at least. And it kind of, it's Peter and Thomas are the first 2 names listed in chapter 21. They're right next to one another, and we know they're both kind of assumed dead. And when that chapter is written, both their deaths are kind of foretold in chapter 21. And so, I mean, it's not there's no direct evidence. We don't have somebody saying that Thomas was the one, but the idea that the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of John share so much in their theologies, even though they don't have direct quotes from one another, there's a lot of scholarship on this one, a lot of parallels between the 2 and their protology and children of God language and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. That maybe Thomas was the beloved disciple, and I think it works for me most of the time. I like it.
Yeah. So if Jesus takes Thomas and tells him secretly, I'll tell you 3 words. They're way, truth, and life. And Thomas what's that?
That's one theory, yeah.
Well, I mean, I can get on board with that. Although he goes back and he tells the disciples, the 3 words are way, truth, and life. Why would they pick up stones and stone him, and then the stones catch on fire and burn them? It seems pretty non-controversial, right?
He is these things. I mean, this is so this is a good argument, right? So you're right. It's not like saying, I am God. And you know what? And Thomas also says you would throw them at me, Thomas, not at Jesus, who was being a heretic, or something like that, right? So you would throw them at me and not Jesus. So I don't. That's a good counter to it. And that is a. So I mean, it depends on how heretical you think claiming to be the way is, right? And how heretical you think claiming to be the truth is, or claiming to be the life. This seemed pretty radical claims in the Gospel of John. And so, it would just depend on if you think those are heretical claims or not. And I think maybe they could have been.
Yeah, or I mean, I guess I'll have to think about that because I mean that is a pretty good argument. Then there has to be like I don't know if we think about it enough, there has to be some kind of slam dunk that says, yeah, that would have to be it, like another parallel.
So I mean, it
Like,
also could have been said in kind of confidence. Because just in chapter 13, it says that the beloved disciple is leaned against the Jesus's lap or chest. So and it says that Peter says, who will betray? Peter says, ask him who will betray. And Jesus says, the one who I give this bread to will betray me. And then he gives it to Judas, and Judas gets up to go. And the text says nobody knew why he gave him this, right? Why he did this. And
yeah,
so a lot of scholars read into this and say maybe he whispered this to the beloved disciple in confidence, right? That we've clearly heard that he said that if I give
okay.
this bread to a person, then right. So clearly, like Jesus said, the one who will betray me, I will give this bread to. Then he gives this bread to Judas, and then the text says
It's so
nobody
confused.
knew why he did
Yeah.
this, right? And so maybe it was the fact that since he's reclined in the breast of Jesus, just like Jesus is reclined in the breast of God in John 1:18. I mean, that image is like is repeating chapter 21's claim that the beloved disciple is the witness that guarantees the message of Jesus, who is the witness that guarantees God or points to God. Right, that parallel, I think, is what I think Dr. Lee was saying. And the result is, if that's Thomas, here in this place where Jesus is talking to him in a way that others don't know what's going on, then just a couple of verses later, the text says, and he said to Thomas, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Then it says, and then he says something in the second person plural starts happening after that. And he starts talking to other people. And so perhaps at one point this was the Thomasine Christians telling you what those three secret words were. In this text, they're in confidence against the breast of God, against the breast of the Lord, who points at God, kind of thing. And that this was, yeah. So that would then indicate that it was in private, kind of like the Thomas 13 would. So that's another way of kind of finagling the argument there. The other one is that in the chapter 1 of John, the first two disciples come from John the Baptist to join Jesus. One of them is Andrew, and the other one is left anonymous. And many people want to say that's the beloved disciple. And this idea that the way of the Lord is the only other place that this word "way" is used is in the prepare the way of the Lord. John the Baptist central, like,
Mhm.
kind of is his main thing that comes out of his mouth. And if Thomas was that anonymous disciple in chapter 1, then when Jesus said, you know the way, that would have really perked up his ears, because he cares a lot about this theology. He would have been a member of John the Baptist's sect before he joined Jesus' sect as Thomas, and would have and would say, oh, well, what do you mean we know the way? He'd be really interested in this. So he'd be the one that would ask this question. Right. And so that would be why one motivating reason why he would be asking this question in John chapter 14 at the beginning of it. So to kind of the thing with a lot of these theories is, one, you have to kind of like take Thomas and put him in that role and go back and revisit your theory with him in that role, kind of thing, and
Mhm.
see how it plays out, which is cool. So a lot of the scholars want to say, well, Thomas is cut out of the Spirit entirely, but they haven't gone back and taken Thomas and put him in the role of the blood disciple, and then see that Spirit is handed over to him at the cross as the continuation of Jesus's ministry
Yeah.
after Jesus dies. And that's what that whole, and like in chapter 8 of John, Jesus makes a clear point that you need two male witnesses to verify things. And this goes on, says, as John makes this legal argument, right? This is a Jewish rule, it's in the Torah, and he puts Joseph and Nicodemus at the burial. Mary Magdalene sees the empty tomb, goes and gets the blood disciple and Peter to validate the empty tomb. He's just gotten two male witnesses in each one of these cases, and then all the males are there at the disciples' meeting to validate this as well. And so he made a careful Jewish legal argument for what's happened. But he doesn't do this at the cross. And I think he was stressed in his narrative. He was unable to do this because he only wanted the beloved disciple there, narratively, to receive the Spirit. And if there had been another one there, there would have been confusion about who received the Spirit. And so the text there, when the blood and water come out, it's like just overflows with like declarations. Okay, no, we know what he's saying is true. Like, it doesn't do this anywhere else. And I think they had to put that there because they didn't have the double male witness at the event, and that was because they wanted to show this as the handoff point that validated their sect, and that they were the true continuers of their sect, guaranteed through the beloved disciple at that time. And so that becomes the Paraclete and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So with the person I give this bread to is the one who will betray me. He gives him the bread. He gives Judas the bread, and then it says the spirit of Satan entered him.
Yeah.
And so you wonder if we have an anti-Eucharist there. And like with the Gospel of Judas, I think a lot of people think it might be fake. I'm not familiar with it, but where it was arranged that Judas betray him, where it would seem in this narrative, Jesus is doing it, right? He's giving him the bread that is has Satan in it, right? And then Satan enters Judas's body, and then he betrays him. So it's almost like he's flipping the on switch for Judas to betray him.
Right. There is a lot of, so this is more of the Jesus is in control kind of story. God's in control of what's happening here. Right. And I think it's really interesting. There's a special word in John 6 that's used for the Eucharist kind of narrative, and it's the Greek word trogo, is a verb, and it's contrast to the word phago, which is your normal eating word, just means to eat. Trogo means I crunch and munch, and I think it's really incarnational. There's like a gnawing aspect to this verb. It's only used in John 6 and in John 13:18. Where he says, the one who has trogoed my bread will betray me. Well, it actually says will bring the heel against me, which is a real interesting use of that word heel, which shows up in the Eden story and is basically in Hebrew the same name as Jacob's name. Jacob is from this word akib, which is for heel. And so there's a lot of neat stuff. I like that topic a lot, but basically he says, yes, Jesus picked this person. He has washed his feet. He has had his feet washed by Jesus. He has eaten of the bread. He has participated in the Eucharist. Satan has entered into him, which is the unfolding that's about to happen, this thing that's going to happen. And this is all like selected by Jesus to happen. And it's all controlled by God. There's a kind of determinism to this. And I think you can tie the two places that word children of God appear primarily, that word pair that sums up to 153, are in chapter 6 with the children of God who came down and had babies with the daughters of men or something. It's this odd sequence. But the other place is in Job, where the sons of God or children of God, the B'nai HaElohim, are there and Satan's among them. Right. And so like, right in the opening of Job, Satan is among the children of God. And so as then the story unfolds in Job, but that perhaps this idea that Satan is there among the children of God is being paralleled in the story. And Job has a very you're in control of everything ending God. I mean, like Job is this real problem for theodicies that are based on merit and deserving, because if anybody deserves anything, it's Job, and it's just all destroyed. And the whole point is, who the hell are you? Like, what are you talking about? And Job says, I see, I'm not in control of any of this. None of this is deserving to anybody. And then he pours ashes on his head. And it's a real kind of down sounding take, but this is kind of, I think, the barrier through which you get. And I think that book starts with Satan among the children of God. And then this realization occurs through Job that results in people kind of in Job in this state of kind of like emptying of his claims. And then maybe the writer was thinking in these terms, which is not a dualism of Satan against God kind of thing, and that and that Satan's in control. Basically, the Zoroastrian, darkness God and the light God, and that kind of thing. Which I think mostly what modern Christianity is basically Zoroastrianism in that sense, not monotheism, and so I think maybe John was riffing on that idea that Satan is here among the children of God, and this is like part of the way the world works. And the word diabolos means like false accuser, someone that judges. I mean, all accusations are false, you might say, right? In terms of judgment. And so Judas is then the one that that goes and does this. But it seems like he's chosen by Jesus to do this. You're right. But yeah, I don't know. I think there's a lot of there's probably a lot of stress. If anything's going to be like addressed, I think like it says that Judas like held the common purse for the group. And I think this would have been really like contentious early on, right? So he's clearly trusted on some level. He's holding the money for the group. But then there's all this kind of like parenthetical comments that he's a thief, or he's a whatever. He's stealing the money and not giving it to the poor kind of thing, or whatever. And it seems like maybe if there was some sort of like, this is how it has to go, kind of thing, that would have moved. It would have been taken over by people who were trying to rationalize and say, no, this didn't have to happen, and that this would be a prime place for edits to be made around this idea that would make it seem negative. But I don't think John's trying to say that.
Yeah. And so with the idea of being present and not looking to the future, do we think that apocalyptic end times is like a metaphor and was intended by the writers to be a metaphor?
Right. The conversation he has with Martha when he says, do you believe the resurrection stuff? She's like, yeah, I know, in the last days, the end of days. And she basically tells him the whole future eschatology narrative. And Jesus says, I am the resurrection. It's like, it's right here.
Yeah.
Right. That to me just screams like realized eschatology here and now. My favorite is John 5:24. Anyone who hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life and does not come under judgment. Right, is liberated, is taken out from under judgment, not will be judged good or bad. And then it says, but they have passed from death to life. Like he has passed. Right, this idea that's realized eschatology. And that is, I think, early joining thought. John 3:14 through 16 through 18, that has some what I think is early thought. It has you can almost just you're there as your archaeologist, and you can almost dust off the layers here. And 3:16, everybody knows, is the most quoted verse in the Bible. Like I said, I think it's translated wrong. The only begotten is the one of a kind, and that's to be like Jesus is to paradoxically be like nothing else, to be unable to describe what you are, to be perfectly you and not compared to something else, not under judgment. And then it says in chapter 3, right, it has I'm sure I get this right, and the translators have a hard time with it. It's John 3:17. God did not send the Son in the world to judge the world, but in order that the world might be saved, right? So this is a dichotomy of judgment and life. These are the two trees in Eden. This is the fundamental, the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, of judgment, and the tree of life. And so he's basically stating this dichotomy again here. But the NRSV and most of the translations translate that word judgment as condemn, because they can't think of what it would mean to be out of judgment, right? Because the next verse then says, those who believe in him, in Jesus, are not judged, but those who do not believe are already judged because they have not kind of understood Jesus, right? And so the idea that this was a meta-ethical dualism, that when you understood this, you would be liberated from judgment. And that's what life meant, right? And you would no longer be judged. He says people who don't get this already walk in this world under judgment. Like we do. We walk around like feeling like we're not as we should be. And he's basically, that's basically re-diagnosing the Eden story, right? And so they're already judged. But like I said, the the translator translates this word as condemned, which krino, it's translated elsewhere as judge. In 524, it's translated in the NRSV as judgment. And elsewhere it's translated, it's just judgment or discernment. And so the translator uses the more negative sounding, he didn't come to condemn the world. You know, he did this because then they use this translation because they can't put their mind around the idea that it's about meta-ethics. It's about being liberated from judgment into a deterministic mindset. But the Greek is fine. The Greek is fine with that translation. But it's the translators who all believe in free will and are all come from the tradition of the church around free will. They just can't, like, what does that even mean? And then right away, the next verse this is where the layer seam is. Says, and this is the judgment. Like some guy came in and said, okay, this is here. I need to add a comment. I need to clarify this. And this is the judgment, right? And he says that the light has come into the world and people love darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil, right? So all of a sudden, light-dark dualism comes into chapter 3 and it hasn't been there at all in any of the rest of the narrative. So some guy comes in and the word evil here only shows up here in John. Like there's just no good and bad language in John. To the point where Wayne Meeks in 1996 wrote this essay called The Ethics of the Fourth Evangelist. And he says, there are no ethics in John. Like it just doesn't, there's a crisis within Christian ethics. The stuff in John just, like, they can't find any normative stuff in the text. Like, is it just love one another? Like that's, you know, and that's sectarian and narrow and it's not really, and maybe that's late. But there had been like 6 or 7 books on Johannine ethics in the last, since 96 when he wrote this, and every single one of them starts off quoting his paper, like in the first, like there's a problem, and there's a recent Currents article summarizing the state of the research on it on ethics in the Gospel of John, and it started off quoting this article saying that no, we found some ethics, we're going to keep on digging. None of them can kind of like, that's all like what is good and what is bad. None of them can kind of like move out of that in this third direction of, it's not about that. It's a physics thing. It's about what is, not about ethics. It's about physics, about not ethics. It's not normative. And that's the whole point. But they can't see that direction of motion because their entire cosmology, the translators are, and possibly this guy in verse 18. So it goes into 19. He says, and this is the judgment. And then he goes on, for all who do evil hate the light, and but those who do what is true, at any rate. So it has this kind of entry into John. Just seems like an addition by somebody who takes this meta ethics, liberation from judgment, early version, and that's clearly an earlier version where you will not be judged, because this is added it's commenting on that. This layer of text is commenting on that text, and it kind of moves away from the realized eschatology into a future judgment. Where I think in chapter 5 you have the righteous will be, or the ones who are judged good will go to the resurrection of life, and the ones who are judged bad will. Right. So there's this whole future eschatology that creeps in. But for me, that's one way that you can see a kind of, it's an ideological criticism lens that allows you to dust away the layers. And for me, that the presence of the light dark language there is completely absent elsewhere in John 3. The use of the language of evil, which is nowhere else in the Gospel of John. This lights up as a kind of a narrative that's been scribbled on here to kind of move away. And that just indicates the motion away from realized eschatology, from liberation from judgment as a core early narrative in John. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd imagine there's a bit of like, let the blame be upon us for generations. That would seem to be an addition, right? Because that seems to be kind of antithetical to what we're talking about now.
Yeah, the synoptic take, where, right, exactly. So Ehrman wants to put like the late John is later, and making that progression of blame onto the Jewish people for the crucifixion be like almost ultimate in John, as being the latest text. I don't understand why he reads it this way. I was recently seeing him make this claim. He says his reasoning is that Pilate hands him over to the Jews to be crucified, and that verse in chapter 19. So it uses the same handover verb that hands over the Spirit, and Judas hands him over, and that paradidomi word. So there's a kind of chain of custody language here. rest of the text is like the soldiers crucify him. They like the soldiers are like Pilate's soldiers. When they want to take him down, they have to go ask Pilate. Pilate like writes the sign on the cross and puts it up there and like, wait, no, change it. And he's like, I've written what I've written, buddy. You know, and like so clearly Pilate's like in control in the crucifixion narrative in John. This one idea that he handed them over to be crucified, I don't know, is it a later edition or what? But it doesn't match the rest of the narrative as the Jews owning the crucifixion. It seems to be Pilate in control in John as I read it. So I was struck by this. But this is another one of those things. Ehrman says these kind of things, and he says it because he has a late date in his mind for John, and it kind of like it's kind of like a self-fulfilling deal. It becomes a feedback loop that takes it there. But and so I ran right back to it after I heard him call this. I was like, this isn't unlike the John I understand, and I think it's right. Like Joseph of Arimathea has to go and ask Pilate if he can take him down, and then the soldiers have to come and verify that they're dead. They're Pilate's soldiers; they're not the Jews. And Pilate controlling the whole thing in John. And so this just becomes the cracks in this narrative that John is late, and 90 and 100 AD, or maybe parts of it are. Certainly parts of it are. Certainly the adulterous pericope is a second, third century edition, or the John 5:4 is an addition, we know, and it's not in the earliest ones. The story of the angel coming down and stirring the waters of Bethesda. You know, it's not part of the original story. So certainly things were added. We know that, but then what specifically beyond these things we know, we don't. It's not really clear.
Would you say you'd believe in like a proto-John priority? That the first gospel maybe was a proto-John?
Right. So I think that I believe the claim that this book, that early versions were witnessed by a person who walked with Jesus. Right. The person Jesus. So this is one of the only texts that claims it in the New Testament. And the synoptics clearly don't make this claim. They make the opposite claims. And so like John makes the claim in chapter 21, and the whole metaphor of being in the lap of Jesus kind of for me, kind of like hammers home this idea that is making this claim, not just in chapter 21, but also, and the fact that there's that the chapter 21 seems to imply this untimely death and this crisis seems to be a witness that there were people at the time of the beloved disciples' death who were convinced that this guy was both old enough, the right age, and they were convinced of his story enough to believe that he had this witness of these stories that walked. So I think there's good reason to believe that the witness behind John was a guy that was an actual apostle. This is not to say I think any of the magic is true or any of that kind of stuff, or that, it's kind of things that often go with it. But I think that it got at I think that's part of like why I think this is that this realized eschatology and the determinism. That's one of the reasons I think it's like maybe even like the insight behind Christ and the reason that he had such a hard time being understood. Because I believe John, at least parts of it, were an early version, right? Where like the guy at Bethesda has the realization, doesn't even know the name of Jesus, doesn't even know the name of the person that did it, right? I mean, this is like very low Christology. And I think that's an amazing story, that whole thing. And I think it's really an important story and summarizes a lot of the Torah narrative there. The 38 years match the Deuteronomy's 2 they were in the desert for 38 years. And it kind of echoes the themes. What he comes to realize, the guy at Bethesda, he's asked him, do you want to be healed? He comes to realize, he says, when I want to go get healed, I can't do it. I can't get there before somebody else goes down. And he says, and nobody else will help me do this. And for me, this echoes the thesis in John 1, where it says, you can't do it by your will or the will of others. And he's come to this realization of the theme of John, that it's not about your control. And then he is made whole, right? Now, it wasn't that his legs were made better. He realized a kind of wholeness that was already there in him. And in that chapter is the only where it uses this word from where we get the word hygiene from, this word for soundness or wholeness. It's a unique word in that chapter. And I think it has this double meaning. It doesn't mean that he was actually, this is the problem. If you're if you break your leg or your leg stops working, and then they heal it back to where? Back to where when you were 12? Back to where when you were 13? What if are you not healed until you can run in a marathon? Like, there's just no end to that kind of healing. And furthermore, that story casts it as those who can get in the water first get healed. And it only heals like one of them, right? And when the waters are stirred, if you can get in, you get healed. That's like the opposite of the narrative. That makes the first and the last, not the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, just the idea that was that right. So when they added John 5:4, which says that an angel of the Lord comes down and stirs the water, this gets added in like the 2nd or 3rd century. It completely breaks our ability to see that God's healing is of this kind of liberation from judgment, because it's some like pearl clutching monk who says there's magic going on here, and I have to, there's no allowed magic other than what God does, so I'll attribute these healings to God.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the point of the story was that everyone's sitting around this is the world. Everyone's paralyzed, trying to be something different than they are, trying to get this healing on their own by getting down there first. And what this guy realized was that he's not in control of this, and he's who he is, and he got up and left. And that was the insight that matches, the theme in chapter 1 of John. And he didn't know Jesus' name, but he came to understand what Jesus' name meant. The God saves, not I don't save by getting down there first and having, right? And I think it's got a lot of criticism to bring to today's world, where our health system today is very much like this. The people that can get it the easiest need it the least in a lot of ways, right? And we still have, I think, so at the time, Asclepius's cult was very much he was equivalent to Zeus. He was a human being. He was killed and resurrected. He resurrected people. This pissed off Hades, and so Zeus killed him, and then Apollo got angry, and then Zeus brought him back. And now at that point in time with Jesus, like, Zeus and Asclepius were almost the same person. And so he was like judge over things. If you wanted to go get healed in an Asclepius, an Asclepion, these hospitals at the time, you had to be morally pure. And if you went in and the healing didn't work, it must have been because you weren't morally pure.
Yeah.
And that's directly contrast with the healing of Jesus, who, like, it's not about ethics. And so this is not, I mean, this is I think some good scholarship on this point. It's a major difference between the two cults. But they're still on a Catholic ambulance. You have the Asclepius's rod and you have the cross. They're just directly in conflict, right? This is the normative healing, and you only just supporting empire. And then the one that is connected to a true fact about your wholeness now, as you are, not broken, that is completely separate from all that, right? And so I think it's fascinating that by that verse entering into John 5:4, and that healing getting attributed to God, God's healing is the first and the last, that just blocked us from this kind of interpretation for 1,500 years. And that just is another one of these things that just made the interpretation have to include the idea that God is responsible for this kind of first, last world of this prosperity gospel kind of healing thing. And that it's only in the last, 20 years, say, or 40 years, that NRSV is like, and the NA28 has removed this thing from their Greek. And it shows up in a footnote in the NRSV and NIV translations, and in most translations that go off the NA28. And so we live in a brand new period where that kind of interpretation is even possible. And I think it's just fascinating that whole story about John 5:4 and that narrative is fascinating. And I think in the same way it refers to Deuteronomy 2, where it says the time they were in the wilderness was 38 years. And then it says, and then after 38 years, when all the people who were not the children who didn't know good from bad, in Deuteronomy 1, it says this, when they were all made whole, it says, or gone, God says, get up, cross over. And Jesus says, get up and walk. And it's funny, in the NRSV, that word get up is left. It's left out of Deuteronomy. It just says now cross over. But the word in kum in Hebrew is get up, and it's in King James that way. But you can see it in the Hebrew. But it's left out of the NRSV, so you wouldn't even be able to make this connection if you were comparing NRSV to this. You wouldn't be able to see that it's like a letter for letter, like the 5 pillars of the Torah itself. Everybody's here gathered around the law, trying to figure out how to get healed. And then Jesus brings like the point of all that path, the point of all the law. And the person that gets it then can just walk off from this and move past it. It's been completed in this person. So yeah, I think that's really, John 5 is real center for a lot of what I think was an early story that maybe the beloved disciple sat down and said, I want to figure out how to like convey Jesus's story in a very early low Christology way. And so it probably had to do with an early version. I don't know about dates of this kind of stuff, but it's fun to think you might have been working it out with Jesus as they were walking around and, that kind of thing. And hey, how could we convey this? Oh, well, that pool that's just north of Jerusalem. Okay. All right. Let's riff on the idea that good and bad are keeping people from being healed, from feeling whole. And that's exactly what it says in Deuteronomy 139. They're the only ones that can enter, the ones that don't know good from bad. And so it seems like he's riffing off that. The same protological, get rid of the Garden of Eden fruit, invert the path through Eden. John has Jesus as the serpent, which needs to be raised up in Genesis 3. So John 3, 14, 15 has Jesus is like Moses' serpent that needs to be raised up on the cross. Genesis 3 has the serpent being cast down into the dust.
Oh, yeah.
John has you must be born from above. Genesis 3, one of the consequences is being born from this womb is kind of like painful and toilsome. There's a birth from below that's described. Well, let's invert that with a birth from above. And then the third piece in John is the bread from above. Right. And so in Genesis 3, you have the ground is cursed and, thorns and thistles, and you'll make bread and you'll have to eat it from the ground. And Jesus talks about the bread from below, which brings death, and the bread from above, which brings life in John 6. And so there's a kind of, in John, you can kind of see a kind of inversion of these consequences of eating the fruit of the knowledge of good and bad that lead to this understanding, which is non-judgment. And it's not normative. Again, it's because of the way you now see how the world works. And anger evaporates and judgment evaporates, and it's powerful, and you can move mountains, or you can put boots on the moon or whatever, and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so yeah, it's neat that way. It's yeah. I think that protology in John is a major theme, and I think the baptism, the Eucharist, and then this serpent image, which I think may have been part of early imagery of Jesus, but then was lost because of some demonization of that image also, just like the darkness. That the serpent is a symbol of life and power and eternal life. It was thought to be immortal and shed its skin in death and rebirth, kind of thing. And there were a lot of really interesting symbology around that symbol in the first century that were like they thought that Emperor Augustus was sired by Apollo in serpent form, kind of thing. He was the child of the serpent. Anyway, symbol for wisdom, and there's a lot of really cool stuff, but it gets totally demonized today. Like we don't. But if you think of it in terms of, but that's necessary if you have a kind of like light dark dualism, you need an enemy, you need Satan as an enemy kind of thing. And then it's the serpent, clearly. But I don't think that's true. And I think that when they saw a serpent in a garden, they would have been like, oh, I love having serpents in my garden. They eat all the rats. They eat my vegetables. Mm-hmm. Serpents they're carnivores. They don't eat my vegetables. Give me more serpents in my garden. I love this. Of course, God has a serpent in his garden. And Moses' staff turns into a serpent, represents God. I mean, I think there's plenty of places where you can see early on that this was not a negative symbol. And maybe the joining Christians had this as an early layer. So James Charlesworth has a cool book on that. He's a Princeton Seminary professor, archaeologist, and he's done a lot of fun. It's a labor of love. It came out in 2010. It's good text. Cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's really That's that's a profound way to look at it. It's really tied together. Like, is this all your construction that you put this together, or did you have like a seed in something you read?
Yeah, I mean you see my bookshelf keeps on going that way.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not. I wouldn't say that I find myself like agreeing with lots of people
Yeah.
on this point. It is like I said. I think um, it's hard to convey this. It's hard to communicate it. I think it's hard to. It's really hard to communicate this. I think it's fascinating. I think that dip into fatalism. That when you say you don't have free will, I think it's very common, and so it's hard to get past that. And I think it's such a core ethos of our culture. Like I said, I mean, I think that when like the USA was formed, they had all these competing Christianities, and they took essentially what was the lowest common denominator, which was the free will belief. And so we're the land of the free and all this stuff. And I don't mean that we're the land of the slaves. I mean, it's neither slave nor free. It's a completely different way. It's like those people that try to find ethics in John, but like it's talking about something different, something about physics. And so the same thing goes with trying to communicate this. It's actually a real hard challenge to communicate. And I've been influenced by people like Alan Moore, the cartoonist, the guy that writes the Watchmen and these other comic books and stuff like that. And he has a very similar kind of approach, I think, in a lot of his work. His character, the big blue guy in Watchmen. I don't know how familiar you are with this, Dr. Manhattan. There's like an HBO show, and I think Zack Snyder completely got rid of this. But Alan Moore is a total determinist, and he's very open about this. And his big Superman character is like his Jesus figure in his story. And he's this like infinite power being, and he's like searching the cosmos, trying to find this extremely rare event where like quantum fluctuations cause like oxygen to become gold or something like that. And it's so rare. He's just searching, scouring the cosmos. And he's in a relationship with this woman on Earth at the same time that his like atemporal self is doing this scouring of the cosmos. And he just can't see this about this woman that he's in love with. And there's this turning point in the middle of his comic where he's talking to this woman and everything falls apart. Like this big temple he had built on Mars just collapses. And he comes to realize that the woman in front of her is as rare as any of that, and that his way of thinking was just wrong. He was thinking of things as being in categories of sacred and profane, or just absolutely rare and then boring. And he came to this realization that absolutely everything is a thermodynamic miracle, he says, and just like there's nothing like anything else. And that's this guy trying to convey this in his narrative. And I think that's what he's doing, and I think it's profound. I think it's this same story. Been influenced by Alan Watts, the Zen Buddhist, and former Episcopal. I love his takes on a lot of this stuff. Joseph Campbell has been a big influence, the kind of comparative mythology of him, though I wouldn't necessarily say he was a determinist in his take. I would say Alan Watts is more in that direction. But yeah, among Christians, like I think I tried to get ordained once and went through the process, and they were like, that's. I was trying to say that I believe the church is a place where someone walks in, and they are separated from the rest of the world and feel like they are whole by the way that people treat them, and that is what the church is. And they're like, yeah, that's impractical, and I don't know if they're wrong, but I think that's interesting. That there's a big moralizing component to essentially most liberal and conservative thinking. There's one thing they agree on is this freedom aspect of it, and determinism is like, holy moly, that means all of our justice system and our economic system is predicated on messed up ideas. And isn't that just new talk, And they're like, oh, not really. It's been around for a long time. But yeah, so I think it's profound. So I kind of moved from a career in like Silicon Valley tech and other things into like this avenue of communicating ideas. And it's kind of a thrust in my life right now, is to try to work with this, because I think it's extremely important and profound, like you're saying. and I think it's just the thing there is, and so much of the suffering that a lot of the, like I said, when I serve these social justice oriented churches, I think a lot of the suffering that they see is based on the fact that people have this wrong idea. And it's not a giving up. It's that when you see this idea that, that nobody has free will, that then we can actually solve problems. We can actually get to these problems. We can get to the deeper causes of things, and also do it in a way that is not angry or violent. And that's actually a really awesome way to do it. But yeah. So it is interesting. Like, I think a lot of people bring their lens to the Bible, and so I do often question, so like if a guy comes and reads guy stuff and patriarchy into the Bible, then that's one, okay, and maybe it's there. And if a feminist comes and reads, women empowerment stuff in the Bible, and then, okay, maybe that's there. But I come from a background, I was determinist before I kind of brought this lens to the text, and it's just been fascinating to me that it just keeps on seeming to pop up. But I often question myself, am I reading this into this stuff? But I do think there's something to it there. I think it's there, but it's very hard to preach it. And I think it's probably, and I think if anything, you might say that Jesus failed remarkably at teaching this fact. Given I live next door to a Catholic church, given how moralizing these groups have become, how meritocratic these groups have become. If this was the message, then in terms of communicating it, and I mean this with like respect for the greatest respect for these materials, and thinking that I'm so surprised that what we have seems to still capture any of it. But what a spectacular failure that this big beast that's come up out of the Christian church is so moralizing and so judgmental, and is only being kind of tamed in a way by the kind of scientific revolution that started like 400 years ago. And it's remarkable, but I'm hopeful about it. Like I said, I think this is the direction that a lot is moving, and that is in a lot of ways, the millennium was kicked off by Galileo, you might say. That's another story, is that when Galileo was around, Aristotle's cosmology reigned, and good was literally up and bad was down. Like, it was, the knowledge of good and bad was part of our cosmology, and God was the highest good. And so we raise up our hands to God and all these positions, which are just totally transcendent and docetic. When Jesus is like, look here, look at the eminent stuff too. Right. But Aristotle's physics reigned, and you had the earth was at the center, good was up, bad was down. When Galileo moved the earth in our cosmology to orbit, Copernicus and Galileo and Kepler, he basically broke the hold of Satan on the world, you might say, on our minds, right? He essentially drew the knowledge of good and bad out of our cosmology. There was no longer up or down. There was only wherever you were. It was like relativism first entering into things, right? The earth was now floating out there in space, ungrounded, and everybody was pointed in some different direction depending on the time of year, and there were no directions anymore. And so there was no grounding for ethics anymore. And I think this was one of the things that scared the hell out of the church. I think rightfully so. And it's now receded into like Kantian or Descartes' mind-body dualism of moral agents inside of flesh cages, which is, totally, I think, anti the kind of Christian original message. But it's become the thing we have today. But I think Galileo, in a way, broke the hold of the knowledge of good and bad on our cosmology to start with. And we've been in a progress of progressively moving towards a kind of paradisical state in terms of seeing the world as whole and not broken, and back to a place where we don't judge people. And then all the progress you can see has been on trading off judgment for understanding. And all the scientific progress we've made that has just remapped the world has been about that, moving in that direction. So I'm hopeful about it. But it's very hard to communicate this. And like you noticed, it is not a common view, but it is I'm convinced. And I want to convince others on it. So.
Yeah, I think maybe you could preach some aspects of it. It's a lot for like one sermon.
Yeah.
But like, I think it would preach well if you try to convey it simply. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, but it's there's always that barrier of people thinking that it means you're victim blaming, or well, okay, that person that committed the violence, what, they're just not responsible, or something like that. It very rapidly goes to that, and it's hard to avoid it. It's hard to avoid that, honestly. And I believe in my heart that that person that's committing the violence is a victim of violence, and there's a destructive story there that brought this about, and that if that can be solved, both them and their victims' violence are solved, and that's a very powerful way. And,
yeah,
and furthermore, none of the people that commit violence, it's very rare that their violence is being addressed. The violence is done to them is being addressed. And so we're essentially entirely focused on, as Desmond Tutu would say, pulling people out of the river instead of going upstream to figure out why they're falling in the first place.
yeah,
And if you find that out, then you don't have to pull anybody out of the river anymore, right? And so I'm committed to this idea that that's just how scientific progress is, and that's what it means to really be serious about solving problems. But it's really hard to say that and then have and it's really hard to say that effectively and not have it come back as, well, they just shouldn't have done that. I can see my parents, like, had a lot of traumas, but they still shouldn't have done what they did to me when I was a kid or something. Or so and I get that. There's this balance in trauma, as ministry get trained in these things, right? And there's this balance in trauma processing between a forgiveness fantasy on one side, which is that kind of like, oh, they're not responsible, I just need to forgive them, and then a revenge fantasy on the other side. And often the way of helping people through trauma is to create a safe space and then help them navigate a way through that, to recontextualize those without falling into either extreme here. And so it's hard to it's hard to frame it that way effectively and not fall into that trap, because again, people's minds are caught in this what is good and bad, more realism, and they yeah. I mean, like the LGBT community has made so much progress with "I was born this way," right? With moving these ideas of identity to a category that is like the color of your skin, that is something that's just like deterministic, right? And that's how they've essentially entirely gained movement on the cause. And then you have these LGBTQIA plus, like all these labels and pronouns. And what I think these people are struggling with, and we'll eventually get to, all of us are struggling with on these things, is that these pronouns are like categories to categorize people, and the truth is monogeneous. The truth is that everybody is one of a kind. And the reason that we're kind of like bucking against categories and labels right now is because we're coming to this realization. And that this was, like I said, the core philosophy or the core insight from like Einstein and Darwin and a lot of modern science. And that we're getting towards realizing that there aren't a bunch of he's, there's a bunch of you, and every one of them is incomparable. And trying to like find some category label that applies to everybody is just not, is why there's all this suffering, and that's judgment. That's basically saying you're a bad man, or something like that, or a bad male, or you don't fit this archetype, and that's just judgment coming in, as opposed to understanding that they're exactly as they are for a reason. And these archetypes are why we can't get to the solution to that problem, and why we continue to suffer. And that's what the Garden of Eden story is screaming. And it's essentially, that story is essentially held hostage by the church today. And it's really remarkable. I don't know. I feel like a conspiracy theorist on this. And I also feel like it's just absolutely true. And I'm sure all conspiracy theorists feel this way, but yeah, just it's so frustrating sometimes to see all this. But yeah, so I don't know. It's some of the stuff you've heard today has been the product of me trying to work on how to communicate it most effectively. And I think it's getting there.
Yeah. And I mean, when we think about it, churches are doing the best they can, right, from their perspective. And really, I mean, not comparing the two, but bigots, I mean, maybe we shouldn't label it like that. There's a victim narrative behind it, right? That there's some way that they were harmed, and there's that same thing that they see themselves as the good guys, right? And there's harm being done to them, and they're not acting in a way to be bad, right? They're acting against what they perceive as bad people,
It's
right?
a deserving narrative, right? It's a narrative
Yeah.
about somebody deserving something, and a narrative about fairness, right? That there's some imbalance that has been done and needs to be set right. It's very core to our justice system, right? But it's really none of that's true. But that doesn't mean like I stand strongly. Like I think this is a big part of how we actually solve like a big push against reparations for slavery, say in the U.S. is, yeah, these people today don't deserve this. They haven't done anything for this. That was their ancestors, right? The idea that we just give them free money. I mean, but that's how you actually make things better. But the reason we can't get through it is because people have a deserving narrative in their mind. And the opposition is entirely about deserving, and there's no deserving. And then the people against it say, no, they do deserve this because XYZ reason about ancestry and inheritance and all this kind of stuff. And there's arguments for reparations for this reason. I'm just like, no, you invest in something, resources, and it flourishes. Do that. Like there's no deserving involved. Like just know this fact about sociology and science and physics. But we can't get past these arguments because people think people deserve things. And liberal and conservative make deserving based arguments. But saying nobody deserves anything sounds like you're siding with the people against the idea, saying they don't deserve something. But I don't mean that, right? So this is one of the fraught places that you get into with this, right? People claim rights and needs and things like that, and none of those are real. Just like good and bad, objectively, ethical realism is not there. And it's in realizing that we can then actually work with each other to get what we want. And that's what I think the whole history of science as its progress has shown. But saying something like nobody has rights in the face of a document like the UN's Declaration on Human Rights makes you sound like a crazy person. And it's because, again, the language is structured to support this normative story. The language of deserving and choosing and all this kind of stuff is just integrated into everything we do. And it's almost like everybody's been gaslit in this crazy way into this way of thinking that's just not real. And the Bible is trying to say this, and then people that own it at the Catholic Church or the other Protestants, whatever, are just saying, no. They knew good and bad. I mean, I open up the first page. It says they have become knowing good and bad at the end of Genesis 3. Oh, okay, good. And that's the entire turn of this whole story is around gaining this knowledge. And the church is like, no, it doesn't mean good and bad. No, don't read that. No, you've got to be good and bad. Let me stop. That's not what that word means. So yeah, and the language just serves it. The language just serves it, and people are raised with the idea that they need to do the right thing, and that so it's really hard to be a parent, say, in this too as well, raise kids in a world where they're constantly normed, but you want them to understand that you see them as whole at every moment in their life, and have that be like an empowering ground from which they can flourish. Yeah, I like to write a book on parenting. I think about raising the perfect child, but it's not that child you think, it's the one you have, kind of thing. And that mindset towards your child actually empowers them to be just amazing, right? Because they feel that, they believe that you feel they're whole, and they're not acting on kind of neuroses about being broken and having to fix something that's not right about them.
Yeah.
So it's got a lot of teeth. It's got a lot of teeth. So
yeah, just like the joke that the feeding of the multitude was a slap in the face to the people who brought their own lunch, right?
Exactly that idea. But I mean, it's the stone soup, right? It may be the metaphor, right, where they passed around the baskets, and people had food. There was a child there with loaves of bread and fish, and so some people put into the baskets and some took out, and there was enough for everybody. And there's plenty of people, right? That's magic. Like that's incredible, and it could happen today if people understood daily bread and living the present, right? And John, I think, knows this. Like he says, he's got Andrew and Philip there in chapter 6, and he says, what are we going to do? And then he says, there's a young child here with 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread, right? And they distribute it, and there's plenty. And so this young child, I think John knows this is a metaphor. The young child is Jesus. The 2 fish are Andrew and Philip, the only 2 disciples mentioned in the story. And the 5 loaves of bread are the Torah, the bread from heaven. And they're spreading this. This is just a metaphor for the way that this spreads like wildfire. This idea among the people that were listening, or that it's such power to nourish. Right? It's man does not live by bread alone kind of narrative, or the bread from heaven kind of story. It's not just food. It's that was the metaphor he was wielding. And then the next story is the walking on water story, and I love John's interpretation of this. I mean, they're going across the lake towards Capernaum, which means the city of comfort in Hebrew, Kefer Nahum, comfort. And they're seeking comfort. They're like, I just want to feel, you could look at it metaphorically like this, let's say. So they're halfway across, right, in the middle of their lives, if this is a metaphor for their life or whatever. They're just rowing across the boat. And then they see Jesus. They're terrified. There's a storm. And Jesus says, I am, ego eimi, the name of God. And then it says immediate. And when they willed to take him in, they were immediately at the land to which they were going. And I think you can read that as teleportation, like they're at the shore of Capernaum, or where they wanted to be changed to right now and here, and they were at that land. It doesn't say that the storm was calmed. It just says I am in the present tense of the verb to be, instead of I should be or I want to be there, or I could have been there. He says I am, and then that transformation, if your boat is the body or the church, and they call that area where all the people sit in the pews, they call it the nave, because it's from the word navy, and the pews are set up just like, if you were going to row, like on the other side of the aisle, old Viking ship or something. And so like, I think that you could view it that way, right? Like I love how John just weaves these metaphors. And then this is not a teleportation story. This is a story about the land to which you want to be, all of a sudden being under your feet where you are. And that's what the understanding of Jesus in the story, understanding what it means, what the message was, this determinism brings to life, and how powerful it is. And it's all about I am, not I should be or could have been, where most people live in the knowledge of good and bad. Right? And so I think John is just, and he's constantly telling people, like, Nicodemus is like, what, do I have to crawl back into the womb to be reborn? He's like, no, it's like, oh God, it's a metaphor, man. Come on. Like, yeah. So Bishop Spong, the Episcopal, he's got the fourth gospel book by him. It's got a lot of great breaking down of the metaphors in John, in this way, the tying the Barabbas story to Yom Kippur, which I think is just beautiful. They capture the criminal as our scapegoat, where Barabbas, the sins of the community are laid on Barabbas, and then he's let go into the wilderness, right? And then that's the Yom Kippur ritual, right? And this was originally a blameless goat, and has been now loaded with our sins, right? And that if you look at a criminal and you realize that we live in a web of interdependence, and that this person who's been smashed into this corner of committing crime and suffering does so because of everything else in a deterministic world, and that we are all tied up in this web of causes that bring that about. And it's essentially labeling a criminal as our scapegoat. I think it's a super insightful, and I can't see any other way of reading. I mean, this is the son of the Father, Bar Abba, and Matthew even names him Jesus Bar Abba. And so you have two sons of the Father there, these identical goats in the Yom Kippur ritual. One is let go. By implication, he's the scapegoat who has all of our sins loaded onto him. And the other one is slaughtered. And that's just the Yom Kippur narrative, right? And that insight into the idea that the criminal is the carrier of our sins is completely different than most readings of Barabbas. It was just a terrible person or whatever, the moral, person, and that it's terrible that he was let go. But I think that's like the ancient Yom Kippur meaning. Whereas today, it's all about opening up the book of life. Yom Kippur, modern celebration is like, okay, now we got to go do good things, and then we'll get all these check marks, and then we'll, everything will be good for us. We'll have blessings and stuff. And that's very much the Christian take too. You got to do the right things, and But the story instead is a deep and early, obviously fabricated, but extremely important insight into the nature of crime and causation and why there was a Yom Kippur ritual anyway. What does it mean to just throw it all on a goat and have it be cleared? What's the Jubilee about? Why does Jesus come to declare the Jubilee? What is this resetting of stuff? I think there was an insight that, like, it's a game we're playing. Nobody deserves any of this. And but this is what you got. And then periodically you reset it because nobody deserves this. And I think that may have been a major part of the early insights into this. And then, just like the Eden story says, judgment came in and made all this suffering happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I love John on all these on his metaphors, on all these points. And it's so hard to hear a sermon on teleportation.
Yeah. Yeah, I love the take on this. It's not teleportation, and there's that it's really sharing resources with the feeding of the multitude. It's not a miracle. I mean, it is, but not really, right?
Well, yeah, but this is the thing, is that, like, I think the whole idea of, like, magic and science has just been broken here. That is the thing I was saying about Alan Moore's book, where the guy just realizes the miracle of what's in front of him, right? And that essentially the whole dichotomy of magic versus not magic is part of a kind of numbing to this reality. And it's just a wrong way of thinking about it. The idea that magic is teleportation. So Thich Nhat Hanh has this great quote: the miracle is not walking on water. The miracle is walking on the earth. Like, every step, viewing it that way. And I think that was core to his Vietnamese Zen Buddhism kind of idea, was this same idea that everything is incomparable and just miraculous, and that it's just a way of looking at the world that just, it seems almost like childish and what I mean, I guess it totally is in the Hebrew language, but, like, in the Hebrew idea of a child, but it's also profound and empowering in a real fundamental way. So I also lament the idea that we have lost the idea of magic, because under determinism, the idea of crafting these ways of conveying ideas. So Alan Moore would say the best way to cast a spell, he's like a crazy wizard. The best way to cast a spell is just to spell, like, out things, like, and to create, like, effective ways of transforming consciousness, which then transforms the world. And that's what the end of John 20 says, is that these things have been chosen and written so that you will come to have an understanding of the following, of that Jesus is all these things, and that through this you will gain life. Like he says that the reason that this was crafted was in order to transform the reader's mind into this way of revealing the kingdom of heaven here and now, like, that's already laid out on the earth. And it's not about after you're dead or that kind of thing. And that John, the original author, considered, whoever wrote that line, considered this way of organizing things to be a skillful way of, conjuring this reality into being. And that there's an entire way of looking at magic in those terms. That kind of just, it gets past the word abracadabra. There's a Hebrew etymology that I like. Bara means I create. Abara means I create. Kadabara means as I speak, or I create as I speak. Kadabra. So dabar being the word for word, that I make words, kind of thing. And that so that's cool. Yeah,
do you think?
Go ahead.
Oh, do you think there might be similar etymology for abraxas?
Tell me more. I've heard that is that a Greek term, or is it a?
Yeah, it appears in Gnostic like amulets, and so it's associated with a figure with the head of a rooster. What is it? The body of a man? I might be off, and then feet of serpents. And I'm pretty sure
that icon. I'm not that familiar with it.
Yeah, but I've always wondered the etymology. It's always unclear. But
Yeah, it sounds like maybe, yeah, I don't know. Yeah,
It
but
sounds like that word.
creating through the word, and the idea that the logos is like a true, is like it's the logic that was originally meant to be there in the Torah, and it's this logic of determinism, and that this narrative, like God being the I am, this narrative of this truth being the logic of the Torah that comes into the world, and is always coming into the world, and can inhabit someone that gets this truth, dwell in flesh in that way, is I think profound, and that it's I think it's cool they use the word logos, with its connections to rational structure and logic and that kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
as well as the word meaning, but also the word meaning, because words have power, and Hebrews knew this, and it was all about creation by a word, and in the stories, and yeah. That's, I think, it's a lot to that. But yeah, so I lament the switch away from thinking magically, thinking in terms of like influencing the world through what we do. And I think all that's gone to people that are in marketing now, and they're the ones casting all the, I want to say black magic, but that uses the wrong dualism.
Oh,
They're cast.
yeah.
I'd say that they're casting manipulative spells into the world in a way to change how you think, and want you to have something and consume something that they want to sell you, and so they want to convince you of why you need to kena this, purchase this, like to grasp this. And so in
Mm-hmm.
a lot of ways, you could say a lot of this kind of like functions of these capitalist forces are, if you want to anthropomorphize it, it's Satan in the world, right? This effective way. If you want to sell a broom and there's a dust bunny, you give the dust bunny legs and you make it run around like a little demon, and then you're like, okay, and and so you got to anthropomorphize your opponent. So if you want to anthropomorphize all that, the forces that keep us in judgment, it's
Mm-hmm.
Diabolos, it's the devil or Satan, and it's not. And but then again, that's hard to you start forming an opposition language, and it's not about that. It's about yeah, it's about total control. It's like, this is the thing, is like I find myself talking to Christians, and it's like this. I'm like, like God is in total control. I would say, like, they use this language, like
Mm-hmm.
absolute omnipotence. Everything that happens according to God's will. Everything. And they're like, no, God's not that. Oh, I have a reason. God doesn't God could, but doesn't. But doesn't mean he's complicit in the evil, because we have free will, and the hoops. There's just so much to it, right? As opposed to this
Yeah.
other way of approaching it, and it feels more declarative and like empowering Christian. But in many ways, I'm an atheist. Like, certainly with respect to those images of gods that they have, the Catholics' God, like certainly with respect to those idols, I am, and I think John knew this. Like when he puts that story of the serpent raising the serpent up on the cross. I don't know if you're that familiar with this story, but in 2 Kings 4, Hezekiah has to pull the serpent out of the temple because it was being worshipped, and he grinds it up into powder. And he's basically like, look, this is copper. This is not a serpent. This is just copper. He calls it Nahustan. Like this just like has this word for copper and Nakash, the serpent, and they're similar sounding words. There's a play on words there, but he says, this is not God, right? And so in John 9, some editor writes that the blind man comes back and like talks to Jesus with some Son of Man stuff at the end of John 9, and he's like, and he says, like, I came into the world for judgment, and then the blind man was made to see, says, worshipped him, Jesus. And I'm thinking, like, the guy that wrote the raised up on the serpent thing clearly knew about how that serpent became worshipped as an idol, and like he knew the story in 2 Kings, and because they go together, and to hear this later thing in chapter 9 where Jesus is being worshipped directly, I mean, it seems to me like extremely pious to go in and like pull the cross out and throw it through a wood chipper and say, look, wood, not. I mean, it seems like, I think that was in John's heart in the early take, and that
Yeah.
this is a low Christology in the raising of the serpent, right? It's like an empty sign that points to God, not God, right? That's the sucking on the fingertip thing, right? So like, I know the guy that makes this comparison between the serpent and Jesus as understanding this truth. which is really sad because that blind man story, the people say this is not the guy that was blind and whatever, and then the text says, but he was saying, I am. And I love that there's this dual meaning there, right? That the guy was saying ego eimi. He was saying the name of God. And then the text says ego eimi, and he's the only other voice outside of Jesus' 7 times that says this name of God phrase, ego eimi, in Greek, the name of God, I am. And I feel like that was what his eyes were open to, was ego eimi, and that John has him saying that. And that's so Christological. Like, this guy was brought to that realization and became Jesus in this conception of the thing. But then the later editors go and they're like, oh yeah, Jesus came back, because Jesus leaves the story after that, and it's this whole like back and forth between a member of the congregation of Christians and the Jews that were exiling them. So that part's probably from a later editor, and that's mostly why the date of 90 gets labeled, is because of this exile from the synagogue and that argument kind of thing. And then even later probably is this comment that Jesus was worshipped by this guy, which is just idolatry in a way. And it's sad to see that. But again, this is another example of how this narrative of progress from a non-judgmental, grounded in the presentism kind of idea moved towards idolatry and judgment. Because it says, it's actually, if 3:14 and 15 and 3:17 and 18 are like talking about non-judgment and this is a sign pointing to God, then this end of chapter 9 has Jesus came for judgment, inverts this, right, and has worshiping of Jesus, which is like worshiping the serpent on the pole, not God. You can essentially see the ideological shift within the community happen between those two sections again, just like the rest of the text. Yeah. So it's a really powerful critical tool. I don't know of anybody else that wields this on the text. I think, like your previous guest, Dr. Lee, was saying, is that most people treat it as the whole division into text forms was essentially gone out of favor, and you move towards this literary unity thing that was kind of championed by Alan Culpepper in the 80s. Mm-hmm. And they say, well, you don't have any textual evidence, and I would say, well, for example, we do know that it was being edited. We have the pericope of the adulteress in John 5:4 that were inserted, but we also have evidence of a multiple, like the synoptics form like evidence of a multiple version gospel. Like it'd be like saying if you only had Mark, or if you only had Luke, but you inferred that a Mark must have existed. Like that, but we know that there was a multi-edition gospel that incorporated most of Mark and then changed some of it and had something else to say. And there was an evolution of thought. But we know, because we have the documents. We just don't have parts of the early versions of John. But the synoptics are like an existence proof that this kind of thing was happening. Right? And so it's really, I kind of lament the shift away from I think it had gotten crazy with the splitting into various sources and all these hypotheses that came out. I think I understand why it's happening, but I kind of lament that it's even harder to break into discourse on this, because one, they all believe in free will, and two, this idea that if there are layers to be found is tends to go out of favor in the last 20 years of scholarship in John. So it's kind of also I don't have a pedigree trajectory through that whole family of academic biblical background. So yeah, it's a interesting, that whole meta narrative around John is and how we studied it, how it's gone from thinking it was 175 AD and Gnostic to like you're like, oh, there's light dark dualism in it. There's nothing in Judaism like this. It must be Gnostic. It must be late. This guy doesn't seem to know anything about Jerusalem. And then we like uncover the pool of Bethesda right where he said it was. And then the Dead Sea Scrolls like witness and light dark dualism that's totally Jewish and like just nearby. And so it's neat how that was originally why the beloved disciple was no longer thought to be John, because it couldn't have been, because this is a late irrelevant gospel. And it's through these new discoveries that we get to bring that date back, but without the baggage of the label of John the Apostle as the author. And so the scholarship has now come back, and very few people think or argue for the traditional identification. And so we're able to have it kind of had to go in our minds forward in time to shake off a lot of the baggage of tradition, and then get brought back through these 20th century archaeological discoveries. And so I think John is in a unique place like that. And so I think it's cool where scholarship could go on it.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
That so I mean, I know we're kind of wrapping things up, although do you think that the synoptics knew John then, and then they kind of dropped a lot of stuff from John and did their own thing?
There's some good arguments that maybe Luke had a connection to the Johannine, maybe the oral tradition, though he doesn't quote it directly. I had a conversation recently about how where Luke tends to diverge from the Passion narrative, he tends to diverge in a Johannine way. But I don't know. Maybe there are arguments that I've seen made that a lot of the contents of the Gospel of Thomas, some of the parables that are in Mark, appear in order as they are in Mark, and that possibly Mark had Thomas as a source. And if Thomas is Johannine thinking and was a precursor to the Gospel of John, then that Gospel of Thomas would have been a kind of common thread between two different people, two different groups early on, where the Mark would be the more Galilean-oriented mind, and then the Judean-oriented mind or the Jerusalem-oriented mind of John. So they might have not been in that big of contact. It's so hard. I definitely see I don't think there's anything in the Christology of John that is not also in Paul, for example. And so I don't really see the justification for this narrative of Christology as a late date. Paul even called his communities in many cases the perfect, using the word teleoi. He referred to them as the whole and complete. And like Philippians 3:14, he uses the same word that's at the end of Matthew 5, I think, where it says, "Be perfect as God is perfect." That same word teleoi is the word that is translated perfect there, is the word that Paul uses to describe his churches in many, but the collection of the perfect, right? And so again, this might indicate an early take of people who saw themselves as whole and complete in these communities, and called themselves the teleoi, the whole ones, the ones that are not judged, the ones that are free from this thinking. And so I really don't think there's any need to put John. I mean, some parts of John late, sure. Maybe there's the argument for the parts where they're feeling exiled from the community. But I don't think there's any reason to put. I think the Logos hymn was probably later. So if you look in even after chapter 21, I think it came in. If you look at the end of chapter 21, the word hologos, the definite article and the word, is used to describe the false idea that people thought of about the beloved disciple that he would live. This rumor had been spreading, but it uses the word logos, like the logos had spread. And it's like the second to last verse in chapter 21. So the second to last verse in the Bible, basically. I mean, in the gospel. And I can't imagine. So it's like a technical term in the logos. It's the logos. Like in the rest of John, there's no distinction between logos and rhema. It's used interchangeably. It's not a technical term. It's obviously a negative term at the end of John chapter 21. But it's like a high technical term here in John 1 through 18, the first verses. And I think of it kind of like the word gay in our language. At a certain point, it meant just happy. And, it meant just gay. I'm gay. And today we know it has a very different meaning. It's a very different technical meaning that evolved for reasons. And nobody would use it to indicate happiness without realizing the double meaning it would have in our writing today. So I can't see how an author of the appendix of chapter 21 knew of the Logos hymn and would be able to wield hologos to describe a false idea that had been spreading among the group. If you knew of Logos as this term that was God, right? And one would wield it this way. So I see that as so that's I wrote it down here. That's from a JBL article in '93 by a guy named Miller, Johannine Origins of the Johannine Logos. And that's his argument, is that basically not that last part about chapter 21, but basically that it developed over time in the Johannine community and is lit. Because even First John starts off with Word of God kind of language, but it's not quite there, but it seems like progress towards the Logos. And so you can kind of read within the Johannine community this idea of the Word of God, or the meaning, like the rational structure, the logic of the Torah, that is the logic of reality. It became a technical term that was added later. And so I tend to see the Logos hymn as later even than the appendix, for that reason. I think it's a pretty solid argument. I think it's got to be, you have to provide some good reason against that take. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
And I've heard that a reason to think that there's Johannine priority is that the Johannine ending, where the disciples don't recognize Jesus, right? They don't know he's been resurrected, fits Mark better than the Markan ending does, right? And that it's exactly what you would expect to see. And then how they go into like handling serpents and whatnot, which it just seems a little bit off from the Markan ending. So that's why they say it's probably tacked on later. And it's like Mark was meant to be more Greek, so it fits a Greek tragedy. So they just lop off the ending, where tragedies kind of reflect real life. Like, so this guy, our family member, dies. What do we even do, right? Yeah. And it's this whole thing, like that we're at a loss, the end, right? And so, like, you would think that maybe there was a longer thing, and then Mark is chopped off, which they might have been using John as a source for that.
Yeah, so John has an odd plural. Mary says, "We don't know where they have taken him." About the body, when she talks to the lips, that they've taken the Lord, and we don't know where they've taken him. And so the story seems to want to put Mary Magdalene at the tomb alone for some reason, so she can have the first meeting with Jesus in John. But it seems to be reading from a source that is more like the Markan source, and has many women there, so that maybe that first person plural is a hangover from when there were more women there in the story, and they just didn't change that pronoun. So that's a theory I've heard about this. And so, yeah, that might be an argument the other way around. But like I said, I think it's possible that that maybe that whole resurrection like section was added, and that really John left it all on the cross. And just that was where the initial story was, and that maybe that part was even like I can't imagine. I don't know. I think about like that insane picture of the Buddhist, the Vietnamese Buddhist that burned himself, immolated himself, and sat still through it in that photo. It's just remarkable. And so when I think about the difference between Jesus on the cross saying it's perfect and handing over the church, maybe, but like to me, like the idea of a lament and scream out that you see in the synoptics is something more human almost than what we have in the Johannine cross. But I don't know. It's hard to say. So there is that argument. I mean, there is a kind of like insanity to what John has in there, even though I think it's like profound and true, and in a very important way. We are all guaranteed to die. So in a way, we are all we're all nailed to a cross that we got to carry, and we're going to expire at some point. And there are only a few people, I think, that can look at the world and honestly believe that it's, maybe nobody can, right? And that can honestly believe this is all whole. But I end up exploding at my kids all the time. I don't really get it. I think I kind of try to get it. It's a practice I try to have, but but it's just so profound. It seems almost inhuman to have the ending of John. But I think the message there is super important.
Mm-hmm.
And like, if this is what Joshua means, like if this is what this important archetype means, and if it can liberate the world from suffering in this really fundamental way, then great, let's write that story. And so I think that maybe the just like the author of John is freewheeling with quoting scripture, I think that he is he's willing to fabricate stories that are parables, because that's how Jesus taught. He's able to use this whole thing as a parable to try to convey this idea that is just revolutionary, and it will just wreck all normative systems that want to try to build these massive control systems and tell you you're not what you should be. And that he wants to say that message. And so in a way, he's crafted this story. So maybe that was early. Maybe people just didn't buy it, or maybe there were parallel narratives about what happened. And so yeah, I don't think that necessarily means that it was later. So I guess it's just hard. I would just absolutely love to just sit there in that time travel back there and see, and just see every version of John, or just have some freaking jar just be broken in Jerusalem underground somewhere, and all these scrolls just pop out, and it's just a whole redaction history of John. It would be just, who knows if that ever happened, but I would love to see how that all unfolded.
Yeah. Or just be there and be like, all right, which account has it, right? Or are you going to find it's really a composite character, and maybe there. I don't know.
Like I said, I don't think that I'd have any problem with that, even if Jesus wasn't a real person or any of that kind of stuff. I mean, like, I believe that the beloved disciple was a student that learned from Jesus, a guy who was a teacher and had a profound divine insight, and was a child of God, not in the idle term of God that I think most people have, but in a very profound and important way. And so I think this guy who wrote this gospel knew this guy, and that they had this really awesome insight and wrote this profound text. But in terms of how it got out of their hands really quick.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's a good place to wrap up. Any last thoughts or conclusions you want to put out?
No, I think it's good. We've covered a lot of ground. Yeah. I enjoyed the chat. It was a pleasure to talk with you on these things. It's one of my favorite topics. Yeah. Love it.
Yep. Absolutely. It's perfect.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thanks for reaching out about this, Elliot.
Yep. Thank you. Have an awesome day.
You too.